There is a version of Australian history that gets taught in schools. It has dates, names, proclamations, a timeline that moves cleanly from one event to the next. It talks about discovery, settlement, frontier conflict, and eventual nationhood. It is tidy, it is manageable, and it leaves out almost everything that actually happened. The version you were given begins with a fleet of ships in 1788. It starts with Arthur Phillip standing on a beach and planting a flag in soil that had been home to human beings for 60,000 years. It describes this moment as the beginning of something, a colony, a civilization, a country in the making, and in doing so, it erases everything that came before, and it softens, almost to the point of invisibility, everything that came after. What really happened when Britain took Australia is not a story that fits neatly into a school curriculum. It is messy and it is dark, and it is layered with a complexity that most official histories have spent 200 years trying to bury. It involves decisions made in rooms in London by men who had never seen the continent they were claiming. It involves deliberate policies designed to erase people from the land they had lived on since before any European civilization existed. It involves massacres that were given no names, diseases released into populations that had no immunity, children taken from their mothers in a program that continued well into living memory. It involves land theft on a scale so vast it becomes almost impossible to comprehend. And it involves a cover-up, not dramatic and conspiratorial, but quiet and bureaucratic and deeply effective, that has shaped the way Australians understand themselves right up to the present day. This is not a comfortable story, but it is the real one. And the real one matters, not because guilt is useful, not because knowing the past changes it, but because a country built on a foundation of silence is building on sand. And because somewhere in the space between what happened and what was admitted, there are truths about power and resistance and survival and humanity that deserve to be spoken aloud. So tonight, we're going to speak them. If you're watching this to fall asleep, that's exactly why I make these videos. Maybe subscribe and let me know where are you right now and what time is it. Before we get to 1788, we need to understand what Britain was doing in the late 18th century, because the decision to colonize Australia didn't come from a sudden discovery, a moment of adventure, or a grand vision for a new civilization in the southern seas. It came from a problem, a deeply embarrassing, logistically inconvenient, politically uncomfortable problem. Britain had run out of places to put its prisoners. For most of the 18th century, Britain had been shipping its convicted criminals across the Atlantic to the American colonies. Tens of thousands of people, convicted of everything from murder to stealing a handkerchief, were transported to Virginia and Maryland and the other colonies as indentured laborers. The system was brutal and profitable, and it worked reasonably well for everyone except the people being transported. And then, in 1776, it stopped working at all because the American colonies declared independence and made it very clear that they didn't want British convicts anymore. The result was a crisis. Britain's prisons were overflowing. The courts were still convicting people at the same rate, transportation was still being handed down as a sentence, but there was nowhere to transport anyone. The government's solution, in the short term, was to moor decommissioned naval vessels in the Thames and use them as floating prisons. These hulks, as they were called, became notorious almost immediately. They were overcrowded and disease-ridden, and people died in them at shocking rates. Something had to be done. And so, in the mid-1780s, a committee was formed to consider alternatives. Various locations were proposed. West Africa was considered and rejected, partly because the death rate from tropical disease would have been catastrophic, and partly because Britain wasn't entirely sure it wanted to establish a permanent presence there. Das Voltas Bay on the southern African coast was another option. A small expedition was sent to investigate, and came back with an unflattering report. The land was dry and barren, and offered very little to recommend it. And then someone brought up Botany Bay. James Cook had visited the eastern coast of Australia in 1770, and his naturalist, Joseph Banks, had spoken enthusiastically about the potential of the region. Banks described the land around Botany Bay as fertile, the soil as capable of supporting agriculture, the climate as temperate and agreeable. He painted a picture of a place that could sustain a settlement. When he testified before the committee examining the transportation crisis, he recommended Botany Bay as a suitable location. What is worth pausing on here, and what school curricula rarely spend any real time on, is the fact that Cook's original instructions when he sailed for the Pacific were not primarily about finding new land for Britain to claim. They were scientific. He was transporting Banks and a group of astronomers to Tahiti to observe the transit of Venus. The instructions he carried included a sealed section that directed him, after completing the astronomical observations, to look for a great southern continent that was theorized to exist, and if he found it, to claim it for the crown, provided it appeared to be uninhabited or provided the inhabitants consented to such a claim. Cook was a careful and generally observant man. He noted, when he sailed along the eastern coast of Australia, that the land was clearly not uninhabited. He saw fires, he saw people on the beaches, he encountered Aboriginal people at several points, and yet he raised the flag and claimed the territory for Britain anyway, justifying this by arguing that the people he saw had no settled habitation, no agriculture, no concept of land ownership in the European sense, and therefore no legitimate claim to the land under European legal frameworks. This argument, which would be refined and formalized in the decades that followed, rested on a doctrine that the English legal system had been developing for some time. It was the concept of terra nullius, a Latin phrase meaning land belonging to no one. The idea was that if a territory had no sovereign, no recognized government, no system of property law that a European nation could comprehend, then it could be claimed as if it were empty, as if its human inhabitants were no more significant than the animals or the trees. Terra nullius was not an honest description of Australia. It was a legal fiction, a convenient lie told to make the theft of an entire continent seem, at least on paper, legitimate. The 60,000 years that preceded Cook's arrival is the part of the story that the textbook version almost always compresses into a paragraph, sometimes less. The standard framing acknowledges that Aboriginal people existed, uses words like ancient and complex and diverse, and then moves quickly onto 1788 and the First Fleet, as though 60 millennia of human history are merely a prologue to the real story, which begins when the Europeans show up. But those 60,000 years are not a prologue. They are the story, and understanding them, even imperfectly, is essential to understanding everything that came after. When the first anatomically modern humans arrived in Australia, they were entering a continent unlike anywhere else on Earth. The megafauna that still stalked the landscape included creatures that would seem fantastical to modern eyes. Diprotodons, marsupial giants the size of rhinoceroses, thylacoleos, marsupial lions with bone-crushing jaws, giant wombats and enormous flightless birds and reptiles of a scale that has no modern equivalent on the continent. The people who came brought with them the cognitive flexibility and the collaborative social structures that had allowed humans to spread across most of the world's landmasses, and they adapted to Australia with a thoroughness and an intimacy that is difficult to fully appreciate. Over those 60,000 years, Aboriginal Australians developed one of the most sophisticated relationships between a human population and a landscape that has ever existed anywhere on Earth. The continent is enormous and enormously varied, running from tropical rainforests in the north to temperate woodlands and grasslands in the south and east, from the red sandstone deserts of the interior to the temperate coasts and the alpine highlands of the southeast. Different groups adapted to each of these environments with a precision that modern ecology is only beginning to appreciate. They developed systems of land management that transformed the continent. The practice of mosaic burning, of applying fire to the landscape in careful patterns at carefully chosen times of year, was not random. It was a technology, a method of managing vegetation, creating habitat for game animals, reducing the fuel loads that could lead to catastrophic wildfire, maintaining corridors of movement across the landscape. The men and women who understood and practiced these burns were not simply burning things. They were farming in a sense, but farming the entire landscape rather than a bounded field. They were managing the country the way you might manage a garden, except the garden was a continent. Water management was another area of extraordinary sophistication. In the western district of what is now Victoria, Aboriginal people constructed elaborate systems of channels and weirs and traps that managed the movement of eels and fish through the wetlands. These systems involved significant labor and engineering knowledge. Some of the eel traps at Budge Bim are estimated to be at least 6,000 years old, making them among the oldest aquaculture systems on Earth. When European settlers arrived in the Western District, they found a landscape that looked in places like it had been deliberately shaped, because it had been. The social and legal systems of Aboriginal Australia were equally complex. Each group had its own language, its own body of law, its own ceremonial life, its own relationships with the land and with other groups across the continent. The system of connections between different groups, mediated through kinship networks and trade relationships and ceremonial obligations, created a web of social order that linked communities across thousands of kilometers. Objects and materials and ideas moved across this network. Ochre from quarries in one part of the continent ended up in ceremonial contexts hundreds of kilometers away. Tools and techniques spread, songs and stories traveled. The dreaming, which is how many Aboriginal people describe the foundational framework of their spiritual and cultural and legal life, is one of the most profound and least understood aspects of human culture. The word is imperfect, a translation of concepts that don't map neatly onto English. It describes a time that is not the past in any simple sense. A set of events and relationships and creative acts that establish the structure of the world and the rules by which people within it must live. The dreaming is not mythology in the European sense of something fictional or metaphorical. It is, within the framework of the cultures that hold it, a living reality, an ongoing relationship between people and country and the forces that shaped both. None of this was visible to the men who drew up the plans for the First Fleet. Or rather, it was visible in the sense that they had access to Cook's journals and Banks's observations. But it was not seen, not registered, not considered legally or morally relevant to the decisions being made. The people who had been living on the continent for 60,000 years were being categorized through a combination of legal doctrine and casual racism as less than fully human in the relevant sense. Their civilization was being defined from a position of extraordinary ignorance as not a civilization at all. The First Fleet left Portsmouth in May of 1787, 11 ships, approximately 1,400 people, of whom around 750 were convicts. The rest were Marines, officers, naval crew, and the families of some of the officers. They carried enough supplies, it was hoped, for 2 years. They carried seeds for planting and animals for breeding and tools for building. They carried the entire material infrastructure needed to establish a settlement from nothing. What they did not carry was any real understanding of where they were going or what they would find when they got there. Banks had spoken enthusiastically about Botany Bay, but Banks had only been there briefly, during the spring, when the rains had made everything look green and inviting. By the time the First Fleet arrived in January of 1788, it was the Australian summer, hot and dry, and Botany Bay looked nothing like the fertile paradise Banks had described. The soil was sandy and poor. The fresh water was inadequate. Arthur Phillip, the fleet's commander, took one look at the place and decided they needed to go somewhere else. He sent small boats to investigate the coast to the north, and what they found was one of the great natural harbours of the world. Sydney Cove, within Port Jackson, was deep and protected and had fresh water running into it. Phillip moved the fleet there, and on the 26th of January 1788, the British flag was raised, a toast was drunk, and the colony of New South Wales was formally declared. The Eora people, who had been living in and around Sydney Harbour for thousands of years, watched this happen. There is almost no record of what they thought. The early colonial accounts mention their presence, describe some initial encounters, note that some individuals seemed curious and others hostile, but the inner life of the people watching a fleet of tall ships sail into their harbour and begin unloading hundreds of strange-looking people with unfamiliar animals and incomprehensible equipment is almost entirely absent from the historical record. We have the colonists' perspective. We barely have a glimpse of the perspective of the people whose world was about to be destroyed. What we do know is that Phillip's initial instructions from the British government included a direction to cultivate the affections of the native inhabitants and to endeavour, by every means possible, to live in amity and kindness with them. These instructions also contained language asserting British sovereignty over the territory, without any indication that this sovereignty needed to be negotiated with or consented to by the people already living there. The contradiction was not acknowledged. Britain claimed the land and simultaneously expressed a desire for friendly relations with the people it was claiming the land from. The logic of this was never examined, because examining it would have required confronting the fundamental illegitimacy of the whole enterprise. The smallpox epidemic that swept through the Aboriginal population around Sydney in 1789 is one of the most significant and most contested events in early colonial history. Within a year of the British arrival, the disease began killing Aboriginal people at a catastrophic rate. The bodies of the dead were found in caves and along the harbour shores. The population of the Eora collapsed in a matter of months. The debate about where this smallpox came from has never been fully resolved, and the question matters enormously, because it goes to the heart of what kind of catastrophe the colonization of Australia was. There are historians who argue that the epidemic was accidental, that the disease was brought in the fleet's medical supplies, possibly in material used to inoculate the convicts and sailors, and that its spread to the Aboriginal population was an unintended consequence of colonial contact rather than a deliberate act. There are others who note that the British had used smallpox as a biological weapon in North America, that the fleet was carrying smallpox matter, and that the timing of the epidemic striking the Aboriginal population while leaving the colonists largely unaffected is suspicious in ways that deserve serious examination. What is not in dispute is the scale of the devastation. The epidemic killed enormous numbers of people. It disrupted the social and ceremonial and economic life of entire communities. It spread inland along trade routes and kinship networks, reaching populations that had never seen a European, killing people who had no idea that anything had changed in the world, and it fundamentally weakened the capacity of Aboriginal people to resist what was coming, because what was coming was the colony's expansion, and expansion from the very beginning meant dispossession. The land around Sydney was not empty, it was not unused, it was not available. Every piece of ground that the colonists cleared for farming or grazing had people who belonged to it, people who had relationships with it that stretched back generations beyond counting, people who had managed it and named it, and built their whole understanding of themselves around their connection to it. When the colonists took the land, they were not simply acquiring real estate. They were severing the most fundamental connections that Aboriginal people had to their own identity and their own existence. The early years of the colony were marked by a pattern that would repeat, with variations, across the entire continent over the next century. The colonists would move into an area. They would begin farming or grazing. Their cattle and sheep would compete with and damage the resources that Aboriginal people depended on. Aboriginal people would respond by taking food from the colonists, which the colonists defined as theft, or by attacking the colonists or their animals, which the colonists defined as violence. The colonists would then call for military protection or take reprisals themselves, and those reprisals, from very early in the colonial period, meant killing people. The word massacre appears repeatedly in the historical record of Australian colonization, but it has been historically underrepresented in the official narrative. For most of Australian history, the violence of the frontier was either minimized, described in euphemisms, or left out entirely. The standard framing of colonial history focused on the achievements of settlers, the hardships they endured, the land they opened up, the towns they built. The people who were killed to make all of this possible were mentioned, if at all, as a kind of background static, a problem that was managed rather than human beings who were murdered. The work of bringing the true scale of frontier violence into the public consciousness is ongoing, and it has been deeply contentious. The Massacre Map, a project led by researchers at the University of Newcastle, has documented more than 400 massacre sites across Australia, locations where historical records indicate that Aboriginal people were killed in numbers of at least 6. The project has been criticised from some quarters as politically motivated. It has been embraced by others as long overdue. What it demonstrates, beyond any reasonable argument, is that the violence of Australian colonisation was not incidental, it was systematic. It was continental in scale, and much of it was carried out with the knowledge and often the active support of colonial governments. The Hawkesbury and Nepean Rivers region to the northwest of Sydney was one of the earliest sites of serious frontier conflict. As the colonists pushed into this region in the 1790s, the Darug people resisted. There were attacks on settler farms and on government workers. The response from Governor Phillip and his successors was to authorize military expeditions. In 1795, Governor Hunter authorized the shooting of Aboriginal people who attacked settlers, and was prepared to consider any Aboriginal person found in a settled area as potentially hostile. By 1816, Governor Macquarie had authorized a campaign against the Aboriginal people of the Hawkesbury region that resulted in multiple deaths, the taking of prisoners, and the hanging of bodies from trees as a demonstration of colonial power. This pattern was not unique to New South Wales. It played out with regional variations in Van Diemen's Land, in the Port Phillip district, in Queensland, in Western Australia, across the length and breadth of the continent. Each new frontier of settlement brought a new cycle of dispossession, resistance, and violent suppression. Each new colony developed its own methods, its own justifications, its own euphemisms for what was happening. Van Diemen's Land, which is now Tasmania, has a particularly significant place in this history because it was the site of what many historians describe as the most complete act of ethnic cleansing in the history of British colonization. When the British began settling Van Diemen's Land in earnest in the first decade of the 19th century, the island's Aboriginal population numbered somewhere between 3,000 and 7,000 people. By 1833, when the last significant group of Aboriginal Tasmanians was removed from the island to Flinders Island, the number was around 200. By the 1870s, the person identified by the colonial records as the last full-blooded Tasmanian Aboriginal, a woman named Truganini, was dead. The story that was told about this in the decades that followed was one of tragic inevitability. The Tasmanian Aboriginal people, this story went, were simply too primitive to survive contact with a more advanced civilization. They died of disease and culture shock and an inability to adapt. This framing was not only insulting, it was false. The Tasmanian Aboriginal people were killed. They were killed directly, in attacks by settlers and by military expeditions. They were killed by disease. They were killed by the destruction of their food sources. They were killed by the deliberate policy of their removal from the land. And the myth of their inevitable extinction was constructed after the fact to explain and excuse what had actually been an act of deliberate destruction. The Black War, which is the name historians have given to the period of intense conflict in Van Diemen's Land between roughly 1824 and 1831, involved organized military campaigns against the Aboriginal population, large-scale drives to clear Aboriginal people from settled districts, and a system of bounties that effectively put a price on Aboriginal lives. It also involved, on the Aboriginal side, extraordinary acts of resistance and military skill. The Palawa people, fighting on their own land against a well-armed colonial military, managed to sustain an asymmetric conflict for years. They used the terrain with a sophistication that repeatedly frustrated their pursuers. They carried out coordinated attacks that demonstrated strategic planning. They were not simply victims. They were people fighting for their survival and their country with every resource available to them. George Robinson, who brokered the eventual agreement that led to the removal of the remaining Palawa people to Flinders Island, is a complex and contested figure in this history. He genuinely believed he was saving the lives of the remaining Aboriginal Tasmanians. He built relationships with individual people, learned some of their language, and worked over years to convince them to accept removal as an alternative to continued violence. What he negotiated was, in its broad outline, a promise of safety, of protection, of land reserved for the exclusive use of the Aboriginal people, of their eventual return to their homeland. Almost none of these promises were kept. Flinders Island was cold and bleak and profoundly unsuitable as a home for people whose entire spiritual and physical existence was oriented toward the mainland of Van Diemen's Land. The population, already traumatized by years of conflict and the loss of much of their number, continued to decline on the island. People died of respiratory disease and despair. Children were not born or did not survive. The community, already reduced to a fragment, contracted further. The colonial government, which had moved the Aboriginal Tasmanians to Flinders Island, partly because it was convenient and partly because it wanted them out of the way, showed little consistent interest in their welfare. By the time the survivors were moved again to Oyster Cove on the mainland of Van Diemen's Land, their numbers were very small. The settlement at Oyster Cove was not much of an improvement. The site was damp and cold, and the remaining community was left largely to manage without adequate support. People continued to die. And through all of this, the colonial authorities and the colonial press were constructing a narrative in which the decline of the Tasmanian Aboriginal people was being framed as a natural process, a sad but inevitable consequence of contact between a primitive people and a more advanced civilization, rather than what it actually was, which was the consequence of specific decisions made by specific people about how to treat a specific population. The story of Truganini deserves particular attention because what happened to her in life and after death illustrates something profound and disturbing about the way colonial societies treat the people they have wronged. Truganini was not the last Aboriginal Tasmanian. She was the last surviving member of the group that had been removed to Flinders Island, and even this framing is contested because there were Aboriginal people of Tasmanian descent who survived on other islands in the Bass Strait and whose descendants are alive and active in Tasmanian Aboriginal community life today. But she was cast by colonial society in the role of the last of her people, a dying remnant, a symbol of vanishing primitiveness, and this role was used to objectify and demean her even while she was still alive. When she died in 1876, she had asked explicitly not to be dissected and displayed, expressing her fear, based on her knowledge of what had happened to other Aboriginal people, that her body would not be treated with dignity. Her fears were justified. The Royal Society of Tasmania had her skeleton exhumed, and her remains were put on display in the Tasmanian Museum, where they stayed for nearly a century. Her remains were finally returned to the Tasmanian Aboriginal community and cremated in 1976, 100 years after her death. What happened in Tasmania was an extreme expression of processes that were occurring across the entire continent, at different speeds and with different degrees of completeness, but driven by the same fundamental logic. That logic was the logic of elimination. Not always physical elimination, although physical violence was a constant, but elimination in a broader sense. The elimination of the connection between Aboriginal people and their land. The elimination of their languages. The elimination of their children's access to their own culture and community. The elimination, ultimately, of their existence as distinct peoples with distinct rights and distinct relationships to the continent they had inhabited for 60,000 years. The legal framework that enabled this elimination was built on the original fiction of terra nullius, but it was supplemented over time by a series of specific colonial and later state and federal policies, each of which addressed some aspect of the problem of Aboriginal existence from the perspective of a colonial government that saw Aboriginal people primarily as a problem to be managed. These policies were extraordinarily diverse in their specific forms, but they shared a common underlying assumption, which was that Aboriginal people were a lesser form of humanity, either to be protected from themselves like children, or to be used as a labor source, or to be pushed out of the way of settlement, or, eventually, to be absorbed into the white population through the breeding out of Aboriginal characteristics. The mission system, which grew throughout the 19th century and continued well into the 20th, placed Aboriginal people on reserved areas of land where they were subjected to strict controls over their movement, their employment, their family life, and their cultural practice. The missionaries who ran many of these missions were often genuinely motivated by a desire to help, by their own lights, but help, as they understood it, meant conversion to Christianity, the abandonment of traditional language and ceremony and social structure, and the adoption of European cultural norms. The help they offered was conditional on the person they were helping ceasing to be who they were. Government-run reserves were often even harsher. The protector system, which existed in various forms across different colonies, gave government-appointed protectors enormous power over the Aboriginal people in their district. A protector could direct where an Aboriginal person lived, who they could associate with, what work they could do, whether their children could remain with them. The protectors were supposed to protect. In practice, their powers were most consistently used to facilitate the needs of the settlers around them, directing Aboriginal labor to stations and farms, moving Aboriginal people off land that settlers wanted, separating families. The removal of children from their families is perhaps the most viscerally disturbing aspect of the colonial assault on Aboriginal life, because it targeted not just people in the present, but the transmission of culture and identity into the future. Children who were taken from their families and placed in institutions or with white families could not learn their languages from their parents. They could not receive the teachings, the stories, the ceremony, the knowledge that made them full members of their communities. They grew up in the alien environment of white institutions, often treated badly, often used as domestic servants, cut off from everything that was theirs. The practice of removing Aboriginal children was not incidental to colonial policy. It was, in many jurisdictions, explicit policy, encoded in legislation, and carried out by government officials and church institutions operating with government support and funding. In the early 20th century, the policy was given a pseudo-scientific justification by the theories of social Darwinism and eugenics that were then fashionable in Australian and broader Western intellectual circles. The idea promoted by officials like A.O. Neville, the chief protector of Aborigines in Western Australia, was that the Aboriginal population could be eliminated not through killing, but through breeding. Part Aboriginal children, taken from their families and raised as white, would eventually merge into the white population. Full-blooded Aboriginal people, denied the ability to reproduce their culture, would, in the language of the time, die out. The problem would solve itself. The continent would become, at last, what the original fiction of terra nullius had pretended it already was. This was not a fringe idea. It was official policy. Neville spoke publicly about his goals. His contemporaries in other states pursued similar approaches. The language varied, the specific mechanisms differed, but the underlying project was the same across much of the continent for much of the first half of the 20th century. The people who were removed, the children who were taken, are now known collectively as the stolen generations. The term came into common use following the Human Rights and Equal Opportunity Commission's report on the removal of Aboriginal children, bringing them home, which was published in 1997. That report estimated that between 1 in 3 and 1 in 10 Aboriginal children were forcibly removed from their families between 1910 and 1970. It documented the profound and lasting harm that removal caused, not just to the individuals who were taken, but to their families and communities, and to the generations that followed. Children who don't know their language or their country can't pass those things to their own children. The damage compounds. The response to the Bringing Them Home report was one of the defining political moments in late 20th century Australian history. Prime Minister John Howard refused to offer a formal national apology, arguing that current Australians could not be held responsible for the decisions of past generations. This position provoked years of public debate. Sorry Day, held annually from 1998, became a moment of public acknowledgement and mourning for the people who had been affected. And in 2008, Prime Minister Kevin Rudd delivered the formal national apology that Howard had refused to give, in a parliamentary speech that was broadcast live and watched by enormous numbers of Australians. The apology was welcomed by Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people and by many non-Indigenous Australians. It was also, and continues to be, critiqued. The gap between saying sorry and doing something was, in the years following the apology, painfully evident. The Closing the Gap policies introduced in the same period aimed to address the enormous disparities between Aboriginal and non-Aboriginal Australians in health, life expectancy, education, employment, and other measures of social well-being. Progress has been slow and uneven. The underlying structural conditions that produce these disparities, the dispossession, the poverty, the inadequate services, the accumulated trauma, have proven resistant to policy solutions that don't address their root causes. To understand why that is, you need to understand that the dispossession of Aboriginal people was not simply a historical event that has now ended. It was a process that created specific economic and social and political structures, and those structures persist. The land that was taken was not returned. The wealth that was extracted from that land, through the labour of Aboriginal people who were often paid nothing or close to nothing, was not compensated. The laws and social norms that enforced the subordination of Aboriginal people to white authority created patterns of disadvantage that do not simply disappear when those laws are repealed. The history of Aboriginal labour in colonial and 20th century Australia is another aspect of the story that has received far too little attention in mainstream historical accounts. For most of the period from the mid-19th century through to the 1970s, Aboriginal people across the continent were the backbone of the pastoral industry. They were the stockmen and the domestic workers, and the shearers and the ringers who made the cattle and sheep stations of the interior function. They did this work under conditions that range from badly exploitative to outright enslavement. In many states, legislation gave station owners and managers the power to direct Aboriginal labour. Wages, when they were paid at all, were often paid in food and tobacco and other goods rather than cash. Station managers could deny Aboriginal workers the ability to leave the station, effectively trapping them in employment they could not escape. The wages that were supposed to be paid to Aboriginal workers in New South Wales were often managed by the government, held in trust accounts that Aboriginal workers were not always able to access. An investigation conducted in the late 1990s found that a significant proportion of these trust funds had been mismanaged, that money was missing or unaccounted for, and that many Aboriginal people or their descendants had never received money they were owed. The subsequent process of attempting to track and return this money was slow and often inadequate. In Queensland, where the system of controlling Aboriginal labour was particularly extensive, the pastoral industry's dependence on Aboriginal labour was an open secret that shaped the colony's entire economic development. The wealth generated by Queensland's beef and wool industries rested substantially on the labour of Aboriginal people who were coerced into working and denied the full value of that labour. When the system began to be dismantled in the 1960s and 1970s, many Aboriginal families were simply expelled from the stations they had lived and worked on for generations, with nothing to show for decades of labour, pushed into the fringes of outback towns where the lack of employment, housing, and social support created the concentrated poverty that persists in many of those towns today. This is not ancient history. There are people alive today who were born onto stations where their grandparents had been put to work under these conditions. There are people alive today who grew up speaking their own language, practicing ceremony, connected to country, until government officials or missionaries arrived and that connection was severed. The events that are sometimes talked about as though they are 2 or 3 centuries in the past are, for many Aboriginal families, lived memory. The 1967 referendum is another moment that has been simplified and sentimentalized in the standard Australian historical narrative. It is described typically as the moment when Aboriginal people were finally counted as Australians, the moment the country decided to include them. This framing, while not inaccurate in a narrow sense, misses some important context. The referendum asked 2 questions. One was whether the Commonwealth should have the power to make laws for Aboriginal people. The other was whether Aboriginal people should be counted in the national census. The yes vote, which passed with over 90% of the electorate's support, said yes to both. But note what the referendum did and did not do. It did not grant citizenship to Aboriginal people. It did not give Aboriginal people the right to vote. These things had already happened in stages across different states in the preceding decades. The referendum changed specific sections of the Constitution, and while those changes were significant, particularly in giving the federal government the power to act on behalf of Aboriginal people rather than leaving everything to the states, the narrative that 1967 was the moment Aboriginal people became Australians is both an oversimplification and, in its implications, somewhat misleading. It can suggest that the problem was essentially solved in 1967, that what came before was regrettable but done, and that everything since has been a matter of moving forward. This is not the experience of Aboriginal Australians. The land rights movement that gained momentum in the late 1960s and through the 1970s was driven by Aboriginal Australians who understood that citizenship rights without land rights were insufficient. The Gurindji people's walk-off from Wave Hill Station in 1966 began as a strike for equal wages and transformed into a demand for the return of their traditional land. The tent embassy, erected on the lawns of Parliament House in Canberra in 1972 by a group of young Aboriginal activists, was a direct assertion that Aboriginal people had not been adequately included in the political structures of the country built on their land. The Aboriginal land councils that were established in the 1970s and 1980s, and the land rights legislation that followed in the Northern Territory and elsewhere, were partial acknowledgements by Australian governments that the original dispossession had been wrong and that something needed to be done to address it. The Mabo case, decided by the High Court of Australia in 1992, was the legal event that finally, officially, ended the fiction of terra nullius as a matter of Australian law. Eddie Koiki Mabo, a Meriam man from the Murray Islands in the Torres Strait, had spent a decade fighting in the courts for legal recognition of his people's ownership of their traditional land. The High Court's decision in his favour, delivered shortly after his death, recognised that the doctrine of terra nullius had been incorrectly applied to Australia, that Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people had maintained relationships to their land that deserved legal recognition, and that this native title could survive in certain circumstances where it had not been extinguished by subsequent grants of other forms of title. The Mabo decision was genuinely historic. It changed Australian law in ways that were profound and far-reaching, but it also had significant limitations. Native title, as it emerged from the Mabo decision and from the Native Title Act that the federal parliament passed in 1993, was a form of title that was relatively fragile, difficult to prove, and easily extinguished. It applied most strongly in remote areas where Aboriginal communities had maintained continuous connection to their land and where competing land interests were less intense. In the settled south and east of Australia, where the dispossession had been most complete and where the land had been most thoroughly regranted and developed, the practical impact of Mabo was more limited. The 10 years between the Mabo decision and the decade of the 1990s were marked by intense political conflict over land rights, with mining companies and pastoral industry interests lobbying hard against the implications of native title, and with governments walking a difficult line between acknowledging what the court had said and managing the economic interests of their constituents. The Whig decision in 1996, which found that native title could coexist with pastoral leases rather than being automatically extinguished by them, provoked an intense and sometimes ugly political backlash, including the introduction by the Howard government of the 10-point plan, which amended the Native Title Act in ways that many Aboriginal people and their advocates argued significantly weakened the rights that Whig had recognised. The Northern Territory intervention of 2007, officially called the Northern Emergency Response, was one of the most divisive government actions involving Aboriginal people in recent Australian history. The Howard government announced it following the release of the Little Children Are Sacred report, which documented child abuse in Northern Territory Aboriginal communities. The intervention involved the federal government taking over aspects of the administration of Aboriginal communities in the Northern Territory, sending in the military and police, quarantining welfare payments, banning alcohol and pornography on Aboriginal land, and compulsorily acquiring leases over community land. Many Aboriginal people and organisations responded with deep ambivalence or outright hostility. They acknowledged that child abuse was a serious problem that needed to be addressed. They also pointed out that the intervention had been announced without consultation with the communities it affected, that many of its measures were blunt and poorly targeted, that it was accompanied by a suspension of the Racial Discrimination Act, which suggested the government itself knew it would not otherwise be lawful, and that its framing of the problem located responsibility entirely within Aboriginal communities rather than examining the structural conditions created by colonial history that contributed to the crisis. The intervention was continued and modified by subsequent governments under different names. It continued to be a source of controversy, with evaluations of its effectiveness offering mixed conclusions, and Aboriginal communities in the territory remaining divided about its impacts and its legitimacy. This is where we are. A country that has been told in various ways and at various moments that it needs to reckon with its history. A country that has made some efforts at that reckoning and has repeatedly retreated from the full implications of what reckoning would require. A country where the gap between Aboriginal and non-Aboriginal Australians in virtually every measure of social and economic well-being remains enormous. A country where Aboriginal people are massively overrepresented in the prison system, where the deaths in custody of Aboriginal people have been documented and protested and investigated and continue. A country where the communities most affected by dispossession are, in many cases, still dealing with the direct material consequences of that dispossession. The textbook version of Australian history, the one that begins in 1788 and treats everything that came before as a backdrop and everything that came after as a process of nation building, serves a particular purpose. It provides a story that is manageable. It allows the country to understand itself as fundamentally good, as a democracy, as a fair go, as a place that has faced its problems and worked to address them. It allows the violence and the dispossession to be treated as regrettable historical events, rather than as the foundation on which the current structure rests. The problem with this version is not just that it is incomplete. The problem is that it makes it harder to understand what is actually happening now. If you don't know that the land rights of Aboriginal people were never fully recognized, you don't understand why native title litigation is still ongoing. If you don't know the history of the stolen generations, you don't understand the patterns of family disruption and intergenerational trauma that make child welfare issues in Aboriginal communities so complex. If you don't know about the history of coerced and unpaid labor, you don't understand the economic foundations of the disadvantage that persists in remote communities. The history is not just the past, it is the explanation for the present. It is also, and this is something that the standard narrative almost never gets to, a history of extraordinary resistance and resilience. The story of what happened when Britain took Australia is not only a story of what was done to Aboriginal people, it is also a story of what Aboriginal people did in response, of the fighters and resistors who died defending their country, of the people who negotiated and adapted and found ways to maintain their culture and identity under conditions designed to destroy it, of the communities that held together despite everything and continued to pass their languages and their stories and their law to the next generation, of the activists who organized and litigated and marched and sat in and spoke up, of the elders who taught and the young people who learned, and the artists and writers and musicians who carried something essential forward into a world that wanted to believe it was gone. The resistance began from the very first days of the colony. Pemulwuy, a Bidjigal man from the area around Botany Bay, led a sustained guerrilla campaign against the colonial settlement for over a decade from the early 1790s. He survived multiple shootings. He was feared by the settlers around Parramatta and the Hawkesbury. He became a figure of such significance that the colonial government put a bounty on his head. When he was finally killed in 1802, his head was sent to England. He was a warrior and a leader, and for a very long time his name appeared in almost no standard historical account of the colonial period. Windradine, a Wiradjuri leader who led his people's resistance during the Bathurst War of the early 1820s, is another name that deserves to be as well known as any of the military figures of Australian colonial history. The conflict in the Bathurst region, driven by the encroachment of settlers on Wiradjuri land and the destruction of the food sources Aboriginal people depended on, resulted in Governor Brisbane declaring martial law in 1824. The campaign against the Wiradjuri was brutal. Windradine survived it and led his people with extraordinary skill. He eventually travelled to Parramatta to negotiate, appearing at a public gathering in a hatband bearing the word peace. He died young in 1829 of wounds sustained in an intergroup conflict, but his story is one of strategic resistance and political intelligence that deserves far more space than it has historically been given. In Queensland, the frontier violence was perhaps more extensive and better documented than anywhere else on the continent, partly because the colony was settled later, and partly because the methods used were more organised. The Queensland Native Police Force, a paramilitary organisation that used Aboriginal troopers commanded by white officers to carry out punitive expeditions against Aboriginal communities, was active from the 1840s through to the early 20th century. Historians who have studied the records of the Native Police have documented hundreds of incidents, referred to in the records by terms like dispersed, which was a euphemism for attacked and killed. The scale of the killing carried out by the Native Police and by the settlers they supported is estimated to be in the tens of thousands. The resistance continued. There were Aboriginal communities that maintained their independence and their cultural integrity in remote parts of the continent well into the 20th century. There were individuals who moved between worlds, operating within colonial structures while maintaining their connections to their own communities and cultures. There were people who used whatever tools were available, the courts, the press, the church, the political process, to argue for the rights of their people. William Cooper and Yorta Yorta Man founded the Australian Aborigines League in the 1930s and organised a petition to the King seeking the rights of Aboriginal people. When Germany's treatment of Jewish people was announced at Kristallnacht in 1938, the Australian Aborigines League organised a delegation to the German consulate in Melbourne to protest, making it one of the very few formal protests against Nazi treatment of Jews from any organisation in Australia at the time. Cooper himself had spent decades fighting for the rights of Aboriginal people in Australia while being denied many of the most basic rights himself. The 1960s and 1970s brought a new generation of Aboriginal activists who would help transform the political landscape. Charles Perkins, who in 1965 organised the Freedom Ride, a bus journey through regional New South Wales modelled on the American Civil Rights Freedom Rides, which documented and publicly exposed the discrimination that Aboriginal people faced in country towns. Gary Foley, who was among the founders of the Tent Embassy and the Aboriginal Medical Service. Neville Bonner, who in 1971 became the first Aboriginal person to serve in the federal parliament. Marsha Langton, whose intellectual and public advocacy has shaped debates about land rights, native title, and cultural heritage for decades. These are figures whose names belong in any honest account of Australian history, whose contributions are as significant as any of the explorers or pastoral pioneers, or politicians who dominate the standard narrative. The cultural flowering that has accompanied the political struggle is extraordinary. Aboriginal literature, art, film, and music have produced some of the most significant creative work to emerge from Australia in the 20th and 21st centuries. The paintings of Emily Kamkangwari, who began painting in her late 70s and produced a body of work in the last 8 years of her life that has been compared to the major figures of 20th century Western art. The novels of Kim Scott, whose work explores Noongar history and identity, with a precision and beauty that has been recognised by the Miles Franklin Award. The films of Avon Sen, whose work on communities in outback Queensland is among the most honest and searching cinema produced in Australia. The poetry of Oodgeroo Noonuccal, whose collection We Are Going, published in 1964, was the first book of verse published by an Aboriginal Australian and remains among the most significant works of Australian literature. These creative works do something that political argument and historical scholarship alone cannot do. They make it possible for people to actually feel, in some small way, something of what it is to be Aboriginal in Australia, to have that particular history, to carry that particular set of gifts and griefs. They create the possibility of a different kind of understanding, the kind that goes beyond information to something closer to shared experience. The question of what a genuine reckoning with Australia's history would look like is one that Australians have been arguing about for decades and have not resolved. It would involve, at minimum, an honest and comprehensive account of what happened, one that does not begin in 1788 and does not sanitize the violence and the dispossession of the centuries that followed. It would involve the legal and economic recognition of Aboriginal relationships to land that go beyond the limited and fragile form of native title that currently exists. It would involve the return of objects and remains held in institutions that took them without consent. It would involve the adequate funding of the programs and services that Aboriginal communities have consistently identified as essential, including community-controlled health and education and housing and legal services. It would involve listening, seriously and consistently and over time, to what Aboriginal people themselves say they need. None of these things are simple or cheap. All of them are contested, and the contestation itself is revealing. Every time an argument is made that going further and acknowledging and addressing the legacy of colonization would be unfair to non-Aboriginal Australians, or would be divisive, or would be opening old wounds, that argument is making a choice about whose discomfort matters more. The discomfort of non-Aboriginal Australians who would prefer not to think too hard about the foundation of the country they live in, or the ongoing reality for Aboriginal Australians, of dealing with the consequences of what that foundation was built on. The Australian continent is the oldest continuously inhabited landscape on Earth. The people who have been living on it for 60,000 years are still here. They survived the smallpox and the massacres and the stolen generations and the missions and the reserves and the coerced labor and the attempts to breed them out and the policies designed to eliminate their cultures. They are still speaking their languages and practicing their ceremonies and fighting their legal battles and making their art and raising their children and demanding that the country reckon with what it did and is still doing. The textbook version says that Australia was discovered and settled and built into a nation. The real version says that a continent with 60,000 years of human history was invaded, and its people were subjected to a systematic campaign of dispossession and violence and cultural destruction, that this campaign has not fully ended, and that the country built on its consequences has not yet fully confronted what it owes. These two versions cannot both be true. Only one of them is. There is a moment, not long after the first fleet arrived in Sydney Harbour, that does not appear in many accounts of Australian colonial history. It involves a man named Arabanu. He was a young Eora man who was captured by the colonists in December of 1788, taken to the settlement and kept there as, in effect, a specimen. The colonists hoped he would serve as an intermediary, a go-between who could help them communicate with the Aboriginal people who were watching the settlement with increasing unease. Arabanu learned some English. He showed extraordinary dignity and adaptability in what must have been a situation of profound confusion and distress. When the smallpox epidemic struck in the first months of 1789, killing Aboriginal people in enormous numbers, Arabanu helped to care for the sick and the dying. He died of smallpox himself in May of 1789, 5 months after his capture. The account of Arabanu left by the colony's surgeon, John White, is one of the few early colonial documents that attempts to see an Aboriginal person as an individual, with intelligence and feeling and character. White wrote of Arabanu with something approaching genuine admiration and genuine sorrow at his death. And then the colony moved on. The experiment of using an individual as a mediator was repeated with other people taken from the harbour, including a man named Bennelong, whose subsequent relationship with Governor Phillip became one of the most complex and tragic stories of the early colonial period. But the essential pattern remained unchanged. The colonists were interested in Aboriginal people to the extent that they were useful or interesting or threatening. The idea that they had rights, that they had a prior claim on the land, that their consent mattered, never seriously entered the practical calculations of the people making decisions. Bennelong's story is worth following because it illustrates something about the nature of colonial contact that the simple story of invasion and resistance doesn't fully capture. He was a man of considerable intelligence and personality. He was captured by the colonists and eventually developed a genuine relationship with Philip, who took him to England in 1792. He spent 2 years in London, meeting people, learning more English, attempting to navigate a world utterly unlike anything he had known. When he returned to Australia, he occupied an ambiguous and difficult position, neither fully accepted by the colonial world, nor able to return without complication to the world he had left. His later life involved violence, displacement, and a degree of despair that his letters, written in uncertain English, convey with unexpected poignancy. He died in 1813, at around 50 years old, in a country that was increasingly not his, and on land that was still in his memory completely and irrevocably his. The point of Bennelong's story is not simply that he was treated badly, although he was, or that the colonists failed to understand him, although they did. It is that the relationship between the colonists and the Aboriginal people of the harbour was never one between equals. However genuinely Philip may have felt friendship or respect for Bennelong, he was acting within a structure that defined Bennelong and his people as subjects, not as sovereigns, as objects of policy rather than as political actors with their own legitimate authority. That structural inequality was not something that could be overcome by personal goodwill. It was baked into the entire enterprise from the beginning. The question of what the British actually knew when they came and what they chose not to know is one that historians have explored with increasing sophistication. The common defense of the colonizers is that they were men of their time. that the ideas and assumptions they operated with were simply those of their era, and that it is anachronistic to judge them by modern standards. There is some limited truth in this. The specific frameworks of 20th century human rights law did not exist in 1788. The concept of native title, as articulated by the Mabo decision, was not available to Arthur Phillip, but the claim that the colonists simply didn't know better than to do what they did doesn't survive serious scrutiny. The British knew from Cook's journals and Banks's observations, and a substantial body of travel writing and philosophical discussion about Indigenous peoples in other parts of the world, that the Aboriginal people of Australia were human beings with their own societies and their own relationships to the land. There were people in 18th century Britain and in the colonies who argued that the taking of the land without consent was morally wrong and legally questionable. The instructions given to Philip, which told him to cultivate the affections of the native inhabitants, implicitly acknowledged that those inhabitants existed and had interests that deserved some consideration. The decision to proceed anyway, to raise the flag and declare sovereignty without negotiation, was a choice. It was made in full knowledge that people were already living on the land. It was justified by a legal doctrine that was itself a construction, a fiction invented to make a morally problematic act seem legitimate. The people who made that choice were not ignorant. They were interested in the land. They wanted the convict labor problem solved. They wanted a strategic position in the Pacific. They wanted the resources that the continent might contain. And the Aboriginal people who were already there were in the way of all of that. So the legal and moral framework was constructed in a way that defined them out of relevance. This is the pattern that recurs throughout the history of British colonialism in Australia. Whenever Aboriginal interests conflicted with settler interests won. Not inevitably, not without argument, sometimes not without significant legal and political effort on the part of Aboriginal people. But the default position of colonial institutions, from the governor's office to the colonial courts to the legislative assemblies, was one in which Aboriginal people's rights and well-being were systematically subordinated to the needs and desires of the settler population. The pastoral expansion of the 19th century, which drove the colonial economy and shaped the landscape of modern Australia, was built on this subordination. The men who drove their cattle and sheep inland from the settled coastal districts into the vast river plains of the interior and the drier country beyond were not moving into empty land. They were moving into land that belonged to specific groups of people, that those people depended on for their survival, and that the arrival of large herds of hard-hoofed animals and the construction of permanent settlers' structures would transform in ways that made the Aboriginal people's traditional land management impossible. The squatters, as the pastoralists who occupied Crown land beyond the official boundaries of settlement were called, had, from a legal standpoint, no valid title to the land they occupied. They were simply there, with their animals and their guns, and the colonial governments eventually followed, legitimizing their presence after the fact. The Aboriginal people who tried to defend their country, who attacked the settlers' animals and sometimes the settlers themselves, were treated as criminals or as military enemies. The violence directed against them was sometimes officially sanctioned and often officially ignored. The diaries and letters and newspaper accounts of the period contain references to shooting and dispersing and clearing that all participants understood, without needing to spell it out in detail, meant killing. The specific cultures and histories and languages that were destroyed in this process are incalculable losses. Australia at the time of colonization was home to somewhere between 500 and 700 distinct language groups. The exact number is uncertain, partly because many languages were lost before they could be documented. Linguists estimate that before 1788 there was something in the order of 250 distinct Aboriginal language families in Australia, representing a diversity of human linguistic and cultural development that was the product of thousands of years of separate development in different environments. Today, around 90 of those languages are still spoken with some degree of fluency, and many of those are endangered, spoken by only a handful of elderly people. A language is not just a way of saying things, it is a way of knowing the world. Each of the Aboriginal languages that has been lost took with it knowledge of the country that was encoded in that language, names for plants and animals and landscape features that contained information about those things, ways of understanding and navigating the environment that had been refined over countless generations. The loss of that knowledge is not just a cultural loss, it is an ecological and intellectual loss of a kind that can never be fully repaired. The revival movements that have emerged in recent decades, in which Aboriginal communities work to recover and revitalize languages that were nearly lost, are among the most remarkable and moving stories in contemporary Australia. the recording of the last fluent speakers, the development of language programs for children, the creation of dictionaries and grammars and learning materials, the gradual return of a language to use in everyday life. These are acts of extraordinary determination and love. They are the continuation of the resistance by other means. What this whole history reveals, when you follow it from the landing at Sydney Cove, is not a question that has been settled. It is a question that has been deferred again and again by the preference for comfortable national stories over the complicated truth. The anniversary of the First Fleet's arrival, the 26th of January, has been Australia Day since 1994. For Aboriginal Australians and for many others, it is a day whose celebratory character is at best deeply complicated and at worst a celebration of the beginning of their dispossession. It is called by many Aboriginal people and their allies Invasion Day. The debate about the date and what it commemorates is, in its essentials, a debate about whether Australia is ready to tell itself the true story of its founding. The true story is not comfortable. It does not lend itself to simple patriotism. It cannot be tidied up. It contains violence and loss and complicity and shame, and also, alongside all of that, extraordinary courage and endurance and creativity and love. It is the actual story of the continent and its people, all of its people. And engaging with it honestly is not a betrayal of Australia, but an act of genuine love for what Australia could be, as opposed to the sanitized version it has sometimes preferred to project. There is a ceremony in the Warlpiri language called the Kodiji, a male initiation ceremony that has been practiced for thousands of years. There are songs in the Yolngu languages of Arnhem Land that carry within them knowledge of the tides and the winds and the movements of animals that has been refined over centuries. There are stories in the Western Desert traditions that encode geological events, including impacts and volcanic eruptions, that occurred tens of thousands of years ago. There are navigational songs called songlines or dreaming tracks that describe routes across the continent in such detail that people who know the songs can travel through country they have never physically visited, guided by the landmarks encoded in the music. These are not curiosities. They are not relics. They are living traditions, maintained and practiced by communities that are still here, still fighting for recognition and for the right to determine their own futures. The strength required to maintain these things across 230 years of sustained assault on every aspect of Aboriginal life is staggering. It is a strength that the standard narrative of Australian history has almost never adequately acknowledged, because acknowledging it would require acknowledging what it was maintained against, and that is a truth the country has found deeply difficult to face. And yet, facing it is exactly what the truth requires. The continent exists in geological time. The stone of its ancient ranges, among the oldest exposed rock on Earth, was here long before any human being set foot on it, and will be here long after whatever stories we are currently telling about it have been forgotten. The Aboriginal relationship to that country, built over 60,000 years, is encoded in language and ceremony and story and ecological knowledge in ways that are irreplaceable. The relationship that European Australians have developed to the same country over 2.5 centuries is genuinely their own, genuinely significant, genuinely part of who they are. These two relationships do not have to be in competition. The recognition of one does not require the erasure of the other. But recognition requires honesty, and honesty requires acknowledging that one of these relationships was built on the dispossession of the other. That the land that European Australians call home was taken from people who never consented to its taking. That the wealth the country has generated since 1788 has rested substantially on the labour and the land of people who were never adequately compensated. That the policies designed to eliminate the Aboriginal presence on the continent, while they failed in their ultimate purpose, caused harm that is still being felt today. This is not a comfortable thing to sit with. It is not meant to be, but it is the truth. And the truth, however uncomfortable, is the only foundation on which something genuine can be built. The night sky over Australia is one of the clearest in the world. From the remote interior, away from the light pollution of the cities, you can see the Milky Way from horizon to horizon, a river of stars so dense it seems almost solid. Aboriginal Australians have been reading that sky for 60,000 years. They have names for the stars and the dark spaces between them. They have mapped the movements of celestial objects with a precision that Western astronomy has only recently begun to fully appreciate. The dark constellations, the shapes made not from bright points of light, but from the dark clouds within the Milky Way, are a feature of Aboriginal astronomical tradition that has no real parallel in European stargazing. The emu in the sky, traced in the dark spaces of the galaxy, can be read as a seasonal calendar, its position in relation to the horizon at different times of year indicating when the emus on the ground will be laying their eggs. That knowledge is still there, still being passed on, still alive in the people who carry it. The sky that Arthur Phillip looked up at in January of 1788, and the sky that the Ayora people looked up at from the same harbour was the same sky. But they were seeing it through entirely different frameworks of understanding. And one of those frameworks was 60,000 years older than the other, and infinitely more attuned to the specific qualities of this specific place. This is, in the end, what the history of Britain's taking of Australia comes down to. A meeting between two different ways of being human, two different relationships to a landscape, two different sets of ideas about what the land was for and who belonged to it. One of those ways of being human came with ships and guns and a legal fiction that said the land was empty. The other had been there for 60,000 years, had shaped the land and been shaped by it, and knew it in ways the newcomers could not even begin to imagine. What happened in the collision of those two worlds is not over. It is still happening. The stories are still being told, still being contested, still being argued over in Parliament and in the courts and at kitchen tables and on the streets of Australian cities. The people whose world was shattered by that collision are still here, still fighting, still living, still creating, still carrying forward everything that was most essential about who they are. The lie in the textbooks is not just a historical error, it is a present-day injustice. And correcting it is not an act of self-flagellation or guilt or political correctness. It is an act of basic honesty, an acknowledgement that this is what happened, that these are the real foundations of the country that exist today, and that knowing the truth is the beginning of being able to do something about what it requires. The story of what really happened when Britain took Australia is still being written, and the people who have the most important things to say about it are the people who have been saying it clearly and consistently since the very beginning. The people who were here before the ships came and who are here still. Listen to them. To truly understand the depth of what was lost and what was fought to be kept, you need to go back further than the ships. You need to go back into the country itself, into the rhythms of a life lived over a span of time so immense it defies ordinary comprehension. 60,000 years. It is not a number that the human mind can hold easily. Civilizations rise and fall in centuries. The Roman Empire lasted roughly 500 years. The entire history of European presence in Australia is barely 2.5 centuries. And before that, measured against those 230 years, there is something 260 times longer. A continuous human presence on a continent. 60,000 years of accumulated knowledge, of cultural refinement, of ecological relationship building up layer upon layer in the minds and bodies and stories of a people who called this continent home in a way that had no word for home because there was no concept of anywhere else. The people who walked the first paths across the Australian landscape were entering a world that was, in many ways, fundamentally different from the one that exists today. The last ice age had not yet ended. Sea levels were much lower than they are now, which meant that the continent extended further in many directions, particularly to the north, where what is now shallow sea between Australia and New Guinea was dry land. The climate was cooler and drier in many regions. The landscape was dominated in some areas by different vegetation patterns than those that exist today, and moving through that landscape were animals that no longer exist. The megafauna of Pleistocene Australia included species that, had they survived, would make the continent's modern fauna look relatively tame. The question of what happened to those megafauna is itself one of the great mysteries and controversies of Australian prehistory. The standard argument for much of the 20th century was that human hunting was the primary cause of their extinction. This argument, sometimes called the overkill hypothesis, suggested that the megafauna of Australia, which had evolved over millions of years without exposure to human hunters, was simply unable to adapt to the arrival of a predator that was more sophisticated and more persistent than anything they had previously faced. The argument had a certain elegance to it, and it fit with patterns observed in other parts of the world, particularly in the Americas, where megafauna also disappeared relatively soon after the arrival of human hunters. But the Australian evidence is considerably more complex than the overkill hypothesis allows for. The dates of megafauna extinction are difficult to establish with precision, because the fossil record is incomplete. Some species appear to have disappeared relatively quickly after human arrival. Others seem to have persisted for much longer. And the role of climate change, particularly the intensifying aridity that accompanied the peak of the last ice age, is difficult to disentangle from the human hunting hypothesis. Some researchers argue that the combination of climate stress and human predation created a double pressure that the megafauna could not survive. Others argue that climate change alone is sufficient to explain the extinctions. The debate continues. What is not in dispute is that by the time of European arrival, Australia's fauna had the character it still largely has today, dominated by marsupials, with the continent's large animals being the kangaroo and the emu and the wombat rather than the vast creatures of the Pleistocene. And that the Aboriginal people who arrived on the continent had, over the millennia, developed an intimate knowledge of every species in every ecosystem, a knowledge that was encoded in language and ceremony and story and practical skill. The mosaic burning that archaeologists and ecologists have increasingly recognized as a fundamental feature of Aboriginal land management transformed the landscape over thousands of years. The grasslands and open woodlands that the first European explorers described as looking almost like parkland, as though deliberately landscaped, were in many cases the product of generations of careful burning. When the Europeans arrived and the Aboriginal people were driven off their country, no longer able to maintain the burning regimes they had practiced, the landscape changed, vegetation thickened, fuel loads built up, catastrophic fire became more common. The country that the colonists thought they were improving by clearing and farming and developing was, in fact, already managed, already shaped to human use in ways they were too ignorant to see. The ecological knowledge encoded in Aboriginal burning practice has been the subject of serious scientific investigation for several decades now, and what researchers are finding is both remarkable and humbling. The practice known in various regional traditions as cool burning, fire stick farming, or cultural burning involves the application of low-intensity fire to the landscape at specific times of year in specific patterns to achieve specific ecological outcomes. It promotes biodiversity because different plant species respond differently to fire, and the mosaic of burned and unburned areas creates habitat diversity that supports a wider range of fauna. It reduces the fuel loads that can lead to catastrophic crown fires. It promotes the growth of food plants, both for human gatherers and for the animals that human hunters depend on, and it maintains the cultural and spiritual connections between people and country that are central to Aboriginal identity. The increasingly devastating fire seasons that Australia has experienced in recent decades, culminating in the catastrophic summer of 2019 to 2020, when fire burned through an area larger than many European countries, killing billions of animals and destroying thousands of homes, have prompted a serious rethinking of fire management policy. There is now much wider recognition among ecologists and land managers that the suppression of fire that characterized European land management since colonization and the replacement of Aboriginal burning with a policy of putting fires out rather than managing them has created conditions that make catastrophic wildfire more likely rather than less. The solution that researchers and Aboriginal communities are increasingly pointing to is the restoration of cultural burning, the reintegration of Aboriginal ecological knowledge into the management of the landscape. This knowledge was nearly destroyed. It survived in the people and communities who maintained it through everything the colonial period threw at them. It is now being recognized, belatedly and partially, as one of the most valuable things Australia has. This is the pattern. The knowledge that was dismissed as primitive and uncivilized is proving, on examination, to be sophisticated and essential. The people who were defined as having nothing to contribute to the development of the country were, and are, the custodians of knowledge that the country desperately needs. The land that was taken on the pretext that it was unused is turning out to have been managed in ways that European land management has consistently failed to match. The history of colonial arrogance is, in part, a history of destroying things that were not understood, and then spending generations trying to figure out how to recreate them. The history of Aboriginal medicine is another example of this pattern. The pharmacological knowledge that Aboriginal communities had developed over thousands of years was largely ignored by the colonists and by the medical establishment that followed them. The plants that had been used to treat specific conditions, the knowledge of what doses were effective and what preparations were needed, the understanding of which treatments were appropriate for which symptoms, this knowledge was accumulated through the same processes of observation and trial and error that underlie Western scientific medicine, but it operated over a vastly longer timescale and with a much more intimate knowledge of the specific plants of the specific landscape. Some of this knowledge has been recovered through ethnobotanical research. Much of it has been lost. The case of tea tree oil is one small example of a larger pattern. The oil extracted from Melaleuca alternifolia, a tree native to coastal New South Wales, has long been recognised by the Aboriginal people of the region as having antiseptic properties. European settlers learned of this and began using the oil, which eventually became a commercially significant product with scientifically verified antibacterial and antifungal properties. This is a pattern that has been observed with numerous plants across the continent. Aboriginal medicinal knowledge being adopted by European-derived medicine, often without acknowledgement, and commercialized without compensation to the communities whose generations of careful observation established the knowledge in the first place. The question of intellectual property and the ownership of traditional ecological and cultural knowledge is one that Australian law and policy is still very imperfectly equipped to address. The recording of Aboriginal music by ethnomusicologists in the mid-20th century, often without proper consent or appropriate attribution, resulted in recordings held in institutions that Aboriginal communities have been fighting to access and control for decades. The patenting of genetic material derived from plants whose medicinal properties were known to Aboriginal people raises issues of biopiracy that international law is only beginning to grapple with. The use of traditional designs in commercial products without the consent of or compensation to the communities whose cultural heritage those designs represent is a persistent problem. All of these issues are, in their essentials, continuations of the same pattern that began with the Declaration of Terra Nullius in 1788. The pattern of treating Aboriginal knowledge, culture, and resources as available for appropriation by the colonizing society without the need for consent or compensation. The doctrine may have been legally overturned by the Mabo decision, but its cultural residue persists. Understanding the depth of what the colonization of Australia meant requires sitting with some very uncomfortable numbers. The best estimates of the Aboriginal population at the time of contact range between 300,000 and 1 million, with many researchers settling on a figure of somewhere around 500,000 as a reasonable central estimate. By 1900, that population had declined to somewhere between 60,000 and 90,000. This represents a population decline of somewhere between 80 and 90% over roughly 120 years. The causes of this decline were multiple and interacting. Disease was certainly the largest single factor. The introduction of smallpox, influenza, measles, whooping cough, and a range of other infectious diseases to populations with no prior exposure, and therefore no immunological experience, caused mortality at rates that are genuinely staggering to contemplate. But disease was not the only cause, and in many regions it was not even the primary cause. Direct killing, through the massacres and punitive expeditions documented by the massacre map, and through individual acts of violence, removed substantial numbers of people. The destruction of food sources, through the introduction of grazing animals that competed with and damaged the resources Aboriginal people depended on, and through the clearing of land for agriculture, caused starvation in communities that had been adequately fed before contact. The disruption of social structures, through the killing of men in fighting age cohorts during frontier violence, through the removal of children, through the forced movement of communities, affected birth rates and survival rates in ways that are harder to quantify, but were nonetheless real. The pattern of demographic collapse that occurred in Australia has parallels in other colonial contexts, from the Americas to Africa to the Pacific. Historians and demographers have studied these patterns extensively, and the conclusion that emerges consistently is that the scale of demographic catastrophe in colonized populations was the result not of some inevitable biological process, but of specific decisions made by specific people and specific institutions. Decisions about whether to provide food to starving people or let them die. Decisions about whether to investigate and prosecute frontier violence or ignore it. Decisions about where to locate Aboriginal communities and under what conditions they would be allowed to live. Decisions about what counted as a legitimate use of land and whose relationships to land would be legally recognized. The people making those decisions in Australia were not unusual by the standards of the British Empire in the 19th century. They were operating within a colonial framework that was normal for its time, sustained by intellectual and moral assumptions that were widely shared across the British and European worlds. The doctrine of racial hierarchy, the belief that some peoples were more advanced in an evolutionary sense than others, the conviction that the spread of European civilization was not only inevitable but desirable, the specific legal and economic structures of British colonialism, all of these were features of the world those people inhabited. Understanding this is not the same as excusing it. The colonist world was not monolithic. There were people within it who questioned the treatment of Indigenous peoples, who advocated for different approaches, who pointed out the contradictions between the stated values of British civilization and the actual practices of colonial expansion. Those voices were there. They were largely ignored. The missionaries, whose role in the history of Aboriginal Australians is deeply ambivalent, were among the most consistent advocates for the basic humanity of Aboriginal people during the 19th century. Whatever the damage their cultural imperialism caused, and it was considerable, they were also often the only voices arguing that Aboriginal people deserved something other than extermination or forced labor. They recorded languages, compiled vocabularies, argued in print and in person against the worst excesses of frontier violence. The records they kept, inadequate and distorted as they inevitably are by the assumptions of their compilers, are nonetheless among the most important sources we have for understanding the Aboriginal cultures of the 19th century. The legal battles of the 20th century that eventually produced the native title framework drew on a very long tradition of Aboriginal people attempting to use the legal systems of the colonizing society to protect their rights. The letters written by Aboriginal activists to governors and prime ministers and the King of England. The petitions presented to the colonial government of Victoria in the 1860s, protesting the alienation of Aboriginal land. The legal arguments made by Aboriginal stockmen seeking the wages they were owed. All of these represent an ongoing engagement with the institutions of the colonizing society, an insistence on being taken seriously within those institutions, even when those institutions were designed in fundamental ways to exclude Aboriginal people. The journey from those early petitions to the Mabo decision was not a linear progress. It involved decades of political struggle, legal innovation, community organizing, and individual courage. It involved people like David Onipon, the inventor and writer whose face appears on the $50 note, who in the early 20th century was arguing for Aboriginal rights while navigating a society that denied him most of the rights it extended to white Australians. It involved people like Jesse Street, a non-Indigenous activist who helped bring the 1967 referendum into reality through years of sustained campaigning. It involved people like Eddie Mabo himself, who began the court case that bears his name, knowing that he was unlikely to live to see its conclusion. The history of how Aboriginal Australians have navigated the colonial legal system, turning its own tools against the purposes it was designed to serve, is one of the most remarkable stories of political and legal ingenuity in Australian history. The Tent Embassy, established in 1972 by 4 young Aboriginal men who put up a beach umbrella on the lawns of Parliament House and declared it a sovereign Aboriginal embassy, was an act of brilliant political theatre that exposed the central contradiction of the Australian political situation. The government of Australia was prepared to recognise the sovereignty of other colonised peoples around the world while refusing to acknowledge any form of Aboriginal sovereignty at home. The Tent Embassy made that contradiction visible and undeniable. The embassy has been maintained with interruptions ever since. It remains standing on the lawns of Parliament House, a continuous reminder that the conversation about Aboriginal sovereignty and land rights has not ended and has not been resolved. The people who maintain it are continuing a political tradition that stretches back to the earliest days of contact, the tradition of saying clearly and publicly that what was done was wrong and that it has not yet been adequately addressed. The concept of sovereignty is one that Australian political discourse has historically been very reluctant to engage with in relation to Aboriginal people. The standard position of Australian governments across parties and across decades has been that Aboriginal sovereignty was extinguished by the assertion of British sovereignty in 1788, that this cannot be revisited without destabilising the entire legal and political structure of the Australian state, and that what Aboriginal people are entitled to is recognition of their rights within the existing constitutional framework, rather than any form of distinct political authority. Aboriginal people themselves are divided about what they want and about what is achievable in this area. There are those who argue for a treaty, a formal agreement between Aboriginal nations and the Australian government, that would provide a framework for recognising Aboriginal rights and addressing historical injustices. There are those who seek a voice to Parliament, a constitutionally enshrined mechanism for Aboriginal people to advise the Parliament on matters that affect them. There are those who argue for full sovereignty, the recognition of Aboriginal nations as political entities with rights analogous to those of other nations. The 2023 referendum on the voice to Parliament was a significant moment in this ongoing conversation. The proposal put to the Australian people was for a constitutional amendment that would establish an Indigenous voice to Parliament, an advisory body that would represent Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people on matters affecting them. The referendum was defeated, with a majority of Australians voting no. The result was deeply disappointing to many Aboriginal people and their supporters. It was celebrated by others who had argued against the voice on a variety of grounds, ranging from objections to its specific form to broader opposition to any form of race-based constitutional distinction. The debate around the voice referendum was, in many respects, a condensed version of the wider debate about how Australia understands its relationship with its Aboriginal people. The yes case rested on the argument that acknowledging and responding to the specific needs and experiences of Aboriginal Australians was not discrimination but justice, that the existing gap in outcomes between Aboriginal and non-Aboriginal Australians was the product of a specific history and required a specific response. The no case rested on various arguments, including concerns about the uncertain practical implications of the voice, opposition to constitutional change in general, and a view that the right way to address Aboriginal disadvantage was through practical measures rather than symbolic recognition. What the referendum debate revealed, among other things, was the degree to which many Australians remained uncertain about, or actively uncomfortable with, the fuller implications of reckoning with the country's history. A society that was fully comfortable with that history, that had genuinely engaged with what happened and what it meant, would have been able to discuss a relatively modest proposal for Aboriginal political representation without the debate becoming as bitter and confused as it did. The difficulty of that conversation is a measure of how much work remains to be done. The work is being done, nonetheless. The growth of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people's political organisation, cultural production, and academic representation over the past 50 years has been extraordinary. Where once the history of Aboriginal Australia was written almost entirely by non-Indigenous scholars working from colonial sources, there is now a thriving tradition of Aboriginal history, told by Aboriginal historians and other scholars, drawing on community knowledge and oral tradition alongside the documentary record, and centering the perspectives and the experiences of Aboriginal people rather than treating them as objects of study. The languages that were nearly lost are being revived. Programs like First Languages Australia support communities in documenting, teaching, and revitalizing their languages. Children are learning to speak languages their grandparents were punished for speaking. Young people are learning the songs and ceremonies that connect them to their country, that their parents and grandparents fought to preserve through everything the colonial period threw at them. These are not simply cultural programs, although they are that. They are acts of political resistance, of insisting on the continued existence and the continued significance of cultures that were supposed to have been destroyed. The art market for Aboriginal work has grown dramatically over the past several decades, to the point where work by Aboriginal artists represents some of the most internationally recognized and commercially successful Australian art. This has brought its own complications: the exploitation of Aboriginal art by commercial interests, the production of fake Aboriginal art, the appropriation of traditional designs without permission, have all been significant problems. But alongside those problems, the growth of community-controlled art centres in remote areas, particularly in Central and Western Australia, has created sustainable economic enterprises that provide income and cultural meaning for communities that have few other economic opportunities. The art that emerges from those centres is genuinely remarkable, technically sophisticated, culturally significant, and of growing importance in the global contemporary art world. The role of Aboriginal culture in defining Australian national identity is complex and often contradictory. Australian national identity has, for most of its history, been defined primarily in terms of European heritage and experience. The bush mythology, the Anzac tradition, the larrikin character, all of these iconic elements of Australian national identity were constructed from the experience of European-descended Australians, mostly male, mostly Anglo-Celtic. Aboriginal Australians have historically been marginal to or completely absent from these constructions of national identity, except as a backdrop, a decorative element, or a problem to be solved. This has been changing slowly and unevenly. The use of Aboriginal imagery in the national iconography has expanded. Aboriginal performers appear at major national celebrations. Aboriginal art and music are recognised as distinctively Australian contributions to global culture. The acknowledgement of country that has become standard at public events, the practice of recognising the traditional custodians of the land on which an event is taking place, has become, for many Australians, a normal and meaningful ritual rather than an empty formality. But the symbolic recognition has not always been matched by substantive change. The gap in outcomes between Aboriginal and non-Aboriginal Australians in health, education, employment, housing, and other measures of well-being remains large. The rate at which Aboriginal people are imprisoned is shockingly high, with Aboriginal Australians making up around 3% of the national population, but over 30% of the prison population. Deaths in custody of Aboriginal people continue to occur, despite the Royal Commission into Aboriginal Deaths in Custody that was established in 1987 and reported in 1991 with extensive recommendations, most of which have not been implemented. The communities most affected by dispossession and poverty are still dealing with the direct material consequences of that dispossession and poverty. The pattern of symbolic acknowledgement without substantive change is one that Aboriginal activists and their allies have been documenting and criticizing for decades. Saying sorry is not the same as doing the things that sorry requires. Acknowledging country is not the same as returning it or compensating for its taking. Celebrating Aboriginal culture is not the same as funding the communities in which that culture is maintained. The gap between recognition and reality is the space in which much of the ongoing injustice lives. What would it take to close that gap? This is not a simple question, and anyone who tells you they have a simple answer is probably wrong. The dispossession of Aboriginal people was not a simple event. It was a complex, multi-generational process that created specific economic and social structures that disadvantage Aboriginal people in specific ways. Addressing those disadvantages requires a detailed understanding of their causes and a sustained commitment to doing what that understanding requires over many years and many political cycles in the face of resistance from those who prefer not to see what happened or not to bear the costs of addressing it. Land return is part of it. In remote areas, significant amounts of land have been returned to Aboriginal ownership and management through land rights legislation and native title. In the settled south and east, where most Australians live, and where the dispossession was most complete, far less has been returned, partly because the land has been developed and is held by private owners, and partly because the political will to address this in any serious way has not been present. The question of how to address land rights in the settled regions of Australia without disrupting the lives of the millions of people who live there is genuinely difficult. But difficult is not the same as impossible, and the difficulty has often been used as a reason not to try, rather than as a challenge to engage with seriously. Economic development in Aboriginal communities is part of it. The poverty of many remote Aboriginal communities is not a natural condition. It is the direct result of dispossession, of exclusion from economic participation during the colonial period, of the destruction of traditional economic systems, and of the inadequacy of the replacement systems that were supposed to be provided. Addressing this requires both the restoration of economic rights, including land rights and the right to benefit from resources on traditional land, and the provision of adequate infrastructure and services. The history of externally designed development programs for Aboriginal communities is not encouraging. Many have failed because they were designed without adequate Aboriginal input and without adequate understanding of the specific conditions in specific communities. Programs that are designed by and for Aboriginal communities with genuine authority vested in those communities have a better track record. Health is part of it. The disparity in health outcomes between Aboriginal and non-Aboriginal Australians is stark and persistent. Aboriginal Australians have significantly lower life expectancy, higher rates of chronic disease, and much more limited access to quality healthcare, particularly in remote areas. The community-controlled health sector, Aboriginal medical services run by and for Aboriginal communities, has been one of the most successful models of health service delivery for Aboriginal Australians, and has produced better outcomes in many areas than government-run services. It has consistently been chronically underfunded relative to the need it serves. Education is part of it. The school attendance and educational achievement gaps between Aboriginal and non-Aboriginal children are significant, and they are connected to a complex web of factors, including poverty, the cultural inappropriateness of many school curricula and environments, the inadequacy of services in remote areas, and the historical legacy of using education as a tool of cultural destruction. Community-controlled schools, curriculum that incorporates Aboriginal knowledge and language, and teaching approaches that are responsive to Aboriginal ways of learning have all shown promise, but they require sustained investment and political commitment. The justice system is part of it. The overrepresentation of Aboriginal people in the prison system is not primarily a product of higher rates of criminal behaviour. It is a product of higher rates of poverty and disadvantage, of policing practices that target Aboriginal communities, of a legal system that was designed by and for a different population, and of the social disruption caused by historical policies, including the removal of children. The recommendations of the 1991 Royal Commission into Aboriginal deaths in custody, if implemented, would reduce the number of Aboriginal people in prison and the number of deaths in custody. They have largely not been implemented. The political will to prioritise this has not been present. All of these areas of action are interconnected. Poverty contributes to poor health, which reduces educational participation and achievement, which limits economic opportunity, which perpetuates poverty. Family disruption, rooted in the history of child removal and in ongoing child welfare interventions, affects educational outcomes and health and social functioning. The accumulated trauma of generations of dispossession and cultural destruction affects mental health and social cohesion in ways that compound all other disadvantages. Addressing these interconnected problems requires a comprehensive approach, sustained over many years, genuinely co-designed with Aboriginal communities, and adequately funded. It requires political leadership that is prepared to maintain commitment through election cycles and through the inevitable setbacks that any sustained social policy effort encounters. And it requires, as a foundation, a genuine engagement with the history that created these conditions, an honest acknowledgement of what happened and why, and a commitment to doing what that acknowledgement requires. This is what the textbook version of Australian history makes harder, by presenting the colonization of Australia as a process that is now essentially historical, by treating the founding of the country as something that happened and then was done, by excluding or minimizing the ongoing consequences of that founding. The standard narrative makes it easier to treat the disadvantages experienced by Aboriginal Australians as the result of something other than what they actually are. If you don't know the history, you can't understand the present. And if you don't understand the present, you can't make the decisions that would change it. The continent is very old. The rock beneath the cities and farms and roads is ancient beyond easy comprehension. Some of the geological formations of outback Australia are among the most ancient exposed rock on Earth. The red sandstone of Uluru, which is only the exposed tip of a vast underground slab, was formed during events that took place hundreds of millions of years before the first human ancestors existed. The land itself has a history so vast that the entire span of human existence on it, 60,000 years, is a thin layer on its surface. And yet that thin layer matters enormously because it is the layer in which human meaning is made. The stories that were told about this rock, the ceremonies that were performed in this landscape, the relationships that were built between these people in this country over 60,000 years constitute one of the richest and most sustained traditions of human relationship with the natural world that has ever existed anywhere. The knowledge held in those traditions is irreplaceable. The cultures that carry them are living and vital and full of things the world needs to know. The people who maintain them deserve to be heard, respected, and supported in the ongoing work of keeping those traditions alive. The story of what really happened when Britain took Australia is not a story that ends in 1788 or in 1901, when Federation created the Australian nation, or in 1967 when the referendum was passed, or in 1992 when the Mabo decision was handed down. It is a story that is still unfolding in the lives of Aboriginal people across the continent, in the debates of the Parliament, in the decisions of the courts, in the communities that are fighting to maintain their languages and their ceremonies and their connection to country against all the pressures that continue to work against that maintenance. It is a story that every Australian, Aboriginal and non-Aboriginal alike, has a stake in, because the country cannot be what it says it wants to be. A fair and decent place, a country that takes seriously its stated values of equity and inclusion and respect for the individual, while the foundational injustice on which it rests remains unaddressed. The attempt to have it both ways, to celebrate the country's achievements and its values while avoiding the full implications of its history, produces a kind of national cognitive dissonance that is visible in the discomfort that tends to attend any serious public discussion of Aboriginal rights and history. Resolving that dissonance requires not just knowing the history, but feeling its weight, understanding not just the facts, but the human reality behind them, recognizing that the people who were affected by the events described in this account were not historical abstractions, but human beings, with lives and loves and families and hopes and griefs, whose suffering was real and whose resilience was extraordinary, and that their descendants are here now, carrying both the consequences of that suffering and the gifts of that resilience, and deserve to be met with the honesty and the commitment that their history requires. The birds of Australia have adapted over millions of years to a continent that is unlike any other on Earth. The kookaburra's laugh, which Europeans arriving on the continent found so strange and so distinctive, is one of the sounds of a world that has been developing along its own evolutionary path for 65 million years, since Australia broke away from the other southern continents. The landscape that laugh echoes across was shaped by the management practices of 60,000 years of human habitation, and then reshaped, not always for the better, by 230 years of European land use. The sounds and the silences of the Australian landscape carry the history of the continent in ways that no text can fully capture, but that the people who have always lived here can read. The country is still speaking, its people are still here. And the version of the story that begins with the whole truth, not the version that starts in 1788 and skips everything that matters, is the only version that does justice to everything the country is and everything it might become. That is the real history of what happened when Britain took Australia. And it is a history that is very much still in the making. The stars outside, wherever you are tonight, are the same stars that have watched over this country for as long as the country has had watchers. They have seen the first people walk the shore of a newly arrived continent. They have seen the fires of management burning across the plains and the mountains. They have seen the tall ships sail into the harbour and the flag planted in the soil. They have seen the massacres and the removals and the long grief of people separated from their country. And they have seen too the survival, the persistence, the extraordinary human capacity for holding on to what matters, even when everything's working to take it away. The story is not over. It has barely begun to be told honestly. But tonight, in the space between waking and sleep, in the quiet where the busy mind loosens its grip, and something older surfaces, it is enough to know that it matters. That the people who were here before the ships came are still here now. That their knowledge and their culture and their connection to this ancient land survived everything thrown against them. And that the truth, however late it comes, is always worth telling. Rest now, the country is still here, its people are still watching the same stars. And tomorrow the story continues. There is a place in the Pilbara region of Western Australia where the rock is covered in images, thousands of them, spread across an area of landscape so large that scientists are still in the process of mapping and cataloguing what is there. The images were made by the Ngaluma and Yindjibarndi people and their ancestors, carved into the hard red stone using tools of the same stone, worked with a patience and a skill that produced images of extraordinary detail and beauty. Animals that walked the landscape around the artists, fish and turtles from the coast to the north, human figures and postures that suggest ceremony or hunting, or the depiction of stories whose content can only partly be recovered. And among the images, something that caught the attention of archaeologists and anthropologists when they first examined the site seriously. Images that appear to represent animals that no longer exist in the region or anywhere on Earth. Animals that lived in a landscape that looked different from the one there now, suggesting that the tradition of image making at this site stretches back not centuries but millennia, perhaps much, much longer. The Murujuga rock art, which is the name used by the Ngaluma and Yindjibarndi people for the collection of petroglyphs in the Dampier archipelago area, is one of the largest and most significant collections of ancient rock art anywhere in the world. For most of the 20th century, it was treated by the Australian government and by the industrial interests operating in the Pilbara primarily as a nuisance, an obstacle to development, rather than a heritage site of global significance. The construction of a port and industrial infrastructure destroyed sections of the rock art. Blasting and heavy industrial activity damaged other sections. The Ngaluma and Yindjibarndi people campaigned for decades to have the site properly protected. The campaign produced partial results. The core area of the rock art was eventually added to the Australian National Heritage List and is now being assessed for World Heritage listing. But industrial operations continue in the area, and the tension between the heritage value of the site and the economic interests of the industrial users of the Pilbara region has not been resolved to the satisfaction of the traditional custodians. This tension between the heritage rights of Aboriginal communities and the economic interests of mining and other industries is one of the most persistent and most bitterly contested areas of contemporary Australian politics and law. The story of the Juukan Gorge Caves, which became an international scandal in 2020, illustrates the persistence of this tension with devastating clarity. The Putukunti Karama and Pinikura people had been seeking the protection of caves in Juukan Gorge in the Pilbara for years, because the caves contained evidence of continuous human occupation stretching back 46,000 years. They are among the oldest known sites of continuous human habitation in Australia. The Rio Tinto Mining Company, which was operating in the area, had received approvals in 2013 to blast the caves as part of its mining operations. Despite the company being made aware of the site's extraordinary cultural and heritage significance in the years following the approval, it proceeded with the blasting in May 2020. The caves were destroyed. The response to the destruction was immediate and international. The traditional owners were devastated. Mining executives and members of parliament expressed shock and sorrow. A parliamentary inquiry was established. Rio Tinto's chief executive and two other senior executives eventually resigned over the incident. The Western Australian government amended its Aboriginal heritage legislation, though the adequacy of the new framework remains disputed. What the Juukan Gorge destruction illustrated was a systemic problem, not just a failure of judgment by one company. The heritage protection framework that existed in Western Australia at the time gave mining companies significant ability to override Aboriginal heritage protections once they had received the relevant approvals. The Aboriginal people, who were the traditional custodians of a site, had limited ability to prevent its destruction if the correct administrative processes had been followed. The law, in other words, was not designed to protect Aboriginal heritage. It was designed to facilitate mining operations while providing a procedural cover that made it look as though heritage concerns had been considered. This is not unique to Western Australia. The relationship between Aboriginal cultural heritage protection and resource extraction is a contested and inadequately resolved area across most Australian jurisdictions. The fundamental problem is that the economic value of the minerals beneath Aboriginal land has consistently been treated by governments as outweighing the cultural and heritage and economic rights of the Aboriginal people, who are the traditional custodians of that land. The royalties and other economic benefits that flow from resource extraction on Aboriginal land have historically been captured primarily by the state and by the companies doing the extracting, with relatively little returning to the communities whose country is being used and sometimes permanently damaged. The native title framework provides some mechanism for Aboriginal communities to negotiate agreements with mining companies through the process known as the right to negotiate. But the power imbalance in these negotiations is significant. Mining companies have resources for legal representation and technical expertise that far exceed what is available to most Aboriginal communities. The time pressures created by mining timelines work in favor of the companies and against communities that need time to consult properly with their members and their elders. And the outcome of the right to negotiate process, if no agreement is reached, is generally not the blocking of the mining operation, but an arbitrated decision that is likely to favor the company. The Indigenous land use agreements that have been negotiated under the native title framework represent one attempt to create more equitable arrangements. Some of these agreements have provided real benefits to Aboriginal communities, including employment, services, financial payments, and cultural heritage protections. Others have been criticized by community members who felt they were negotiated under pressure and without adequate consent. The variation in outcomes reflects the variation in the power and resources of the communities involved, as well as the variation in the willingness of companies and governments to negotiate in good faith. The resources sector is one of the most economically important parts of the Australian economy, and the most significant resource deposits in Australia are disproportionately located in areas of Aboriginal Australia, particularly in Western Australia and the Northern Territory. This creates a situation in which the wealth of the country is substantially generated from land that was taken from Aboriginal people without consent, and the communities whose country it is remain among the most economically marginalised in the country. The injustice of this situation is not subtle. It is enormous, and it is ongoing, and it is very difficult to address within the existing legal and economic framework. The arguments made against changes to this framework rely on the logic of economic necessity and national prosperity. The mining industry is central to Australian prosperity. Changing the arrangements under which mining operates on Aboriginal land would add costs and complexity and uncertainty. The national interest on this logic requires that the rights of Aboriginal communities be accommodated, but not prioritised over the economic imperatives of the sector. This is a continuation, in contemporary form, of the logic that drove the original dispossession. The economic interests of the settler society take precedence. The rights of Aboriginal people are accommodated to the minimum extent necessary to maintain a semblance of fairness, and then set aside. The Torres Strait Islands, which sit in the waters between Australia and Papua New Guinea, are home to the Torres Strait Islander peoples, whose culture and history is distinct from that of mainland Aboriginal Australians, but who share the experience of colonial disruption and marginalisation. The Torres Strait Islander peoples have maintained their connection to their islands and to the sea around them with remarkable tenacity. They are among the most organized and articulate advocates for their rights, and they have taken their concerns to international forums, including the United Nations. The climate change case, brought by 8 Torres Strait Islander community members to the UN Human Rights Committee in 2022, which found that Australia had violated the rights of the Torres Strait Islanders by failing to adequately respond to climate change, is a landmark in the use of international human rights mechanisms to hold Australia accountable. The Torres Strait Islands are among the most vulnerable places in the world to the effects of climate change. Rising sea levels, increasing storm intensity, and the warming and acidification of the ocean around the islands threaten the physical survival of communities whose people have lived there for thousands of years and whose culture is inseparable from their island home. The Australian government's response to the finding was to contest its conclusions and to argue that Australia's climate policy was adequate. This position was widely criticised. It represents yet another instance of the pattern in which the rights and interests of Indigenous Australians are subordinated to the preferences of the state, even when those rights and interests have been recognised by the highest relevant international authority. The relationship between Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Australians and the natural environment is not simply a matter of cultural preference. It is a matter of survival in the most fundamental sense. For coastal communities, the ocean and its resources are the foundation of their food security and their economic life. For communities in the interior, the specific plants and animals and water sources of their country are central to their cultural practice and their material well-being. The degradation of these environments through climate change, through pollution, through the introduction of invasive species, through inappropriate land management, affects Aboriginal communities, not just as a general environmental problem, but as a specific cultural and economic catastrophe. The management of feral animals is one specific example. Feral cats, which were introduced to Australia by European settlers and have since spread across the entire continent, are among the most destructive invasive species in the world. They are estimated to kill billions of native animals every year. For Aboriginal communities in remote areas, the destruction of native animal populations by feral cats is not just an ecological problem. It is a practical and cultural crisis, reducing the availability of food sources that are central to traditional diet and to the ceremony and cultural practice associated with hunting and the management of country. Aboriginal ranger programs, which employ Aboriginal people to manage country using a combination of traditional knowledge and contemporary conservation science, have been one of the more successful models for combining cultural continuity with practical environmental management. Rangers working in their own country, applying the knowledge that has been built up over generations about that specific place, have achieved conservation outcomes in many areas that externally managed programs have failed to match. These programs provide employment and purpose to communities in remote areas. They maintain cultural knowledge and practice. They produce real ecological benefits. They are chronically underfunded relative to the outcomes they deliver and the need that exists for them. The story of the Ranger programs is a small example of a larger truth that keeps emerging from examination of what Aboriginal communities actually need and what works. The approaches that are most effective are those that start from the strengths and the knowledge and the authority of Aboriginal communities themselves, rather than from external ideas about what is wrong and how to fix it. The history of externally designed programs for Aboriginal communities is largely a history of failure, not because the problems are insurmountable, but because solutions designed without genuine Aboriginal authority and participation tend to miss the specific realities of specific communities, and to repeat the colonial pattern of doing things to people rather than with them. The self-determination principle, which was adopted as official government policy in Australia in the 1970s under the Whitlam government, holds that Aboriginal people should have the right to make their own decisions about their own lives. In practice, this principle has been applied inconsistently and has been abandoned or heavily qualified in many policy areas. The tension between the principle of self-determination and the practical realities of remote communities dealing with complex social problems, combined with the political pressures on governments from electorates that are not always sympathetic to the implications of genuine self-determination, has produced a policy history that is inconsistent and often contradictory. What genuine self-determination would look like in practice is something that Aboriginal communities themselves have been articulating clearly for decades. It would mean Aboriginal communities having genuine authority over the services provided to them and the programs that affect them, with government acting as a funder and partner rather than as an administrator. It would mean Aboriginal people having decision-making power over what happens on their country, including in relation to resource extraction and land management. It would mean the full recognition of the diversity of Aboriginal communities, cultures, and perspectives, rather than the treatment of Aboriginal Australians as a single undifferentiated group. And it would mean sustained long-term funding commitments rather than the short-term, program-based funding cycles that make it impossible for community organisations to plan and develop. The knowledge systems of Aboriginal Australia represent not just a cultural heritage, but a body of practical wisdom that the wider society desperately needs. The fire management knowledge, the ecological knowledge, the knowledge of plant and animal behavior and habitat requirements, the understanding of seasonal cycles and weather patterns. These are not museum pieces. They are living knowledge systems that Aboriginal communities are actively maintaining and applying. The growing recognition of this by mainstream conservation science and land management is one of the more hopeful developments in the relationship between Aboriginal and non-Aboriginal Australia. The partnerships developing between Aboriginal rangers and conventional conservation organisations, between traditional owners and national parks, between Indigenous fire practitioners and government fire management agencies, are producing models of collaboration that respect Aboriginal authority and knowledge, while drawing on the resources and the science of the wider society. These partnerships are not always easy. The power dynamics are still unequal. The recognition of Aboriginal knowledge within institutions that have historically dismissed it is often partial and sometimes tokenistic. But the direction is towards something more genuinely equitable than what existed before, and the outcomes, in ecological terms, are encouraging. The question of what a post-colonial Australia would look like, an Australia that had genuinely reckoned with its history and put in place the institutions and the arrangements that reckoning requires, is one that cannot be answered simply. It would be a different country from the one that currently exists, in ways that would be significant but not as threatening as the opponents of change tend to suggest. A formal treaty or treaties between the Australian government and Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples would not undermine the constitutional basis of the Australian state. It would, as in other countries that have negotiated treaties with their Indigenous peoples, provide a more stable and more just framework for the relationship between the state and Indigenous peoples. It would create clearer lines of accountability and more explicit commitments that could be enforced. The recognition of traditional land ownership in forms that go beyond the limited and fragile native title that currently exists would not take land from the millions of Australians who own their homes or run their businesses. It would primarily affect the large land holdings in remote areas, the pastoral leases and the Crown land, where the original dispossession was most complete and where Aboriginal communities are most directly affected. It would require compensation to be paid, which would cost money, but it would represent a step toward addressing an injustice that has now persisted for more than 2 centuries. The funding of Aboriginal community-controlled services at levels adequate to meet the need would cost money. The funding of language and culture programs would cost money. The building of adequate housing in remote communities, which is currently in a state of chronic crisis, would cost money. But the costs of not doing these things, measured in the human costs of poverty and ill health and imprisonment and early death, are also enormous and are borne primarily by the people who have already paid the price of 2 centuries of injustice. These are not arguments that are made in the expectation that they will be immediately acted upon. The gap between what justice requires and what political systems deliver is always large, and in Australia it has been particularly large in relation to Aboriginal rights and well-being. But the argument for what justice requires needs to be made clearly and repeatedly, because the alternative is the comfortable fiction that what exists is essentially adequate, that the main work has been done, that what remains is a matter of fine-tuning rather than fundamental change. That fiction is the textbook version. It is not the truth. The truth is that Australia was built on the taking of a continent from its people, that the taking involved violence and disease and deliberate destruction of culture on a scale that was genocidal in its effects, if not always in its explicit intent. that the structures built on that foundation continue to disadvantage and to harm the people whose land and labor and culture were taken, that the acknowledgement of this, which has been partial and inconsistent, has not yet been followed by the substantive change that the acknowledgement implies, and that the people who suffered the taking and who continue to pay its costs are still here, still fighting, still insisting that the truth be told, and that something real be done about what the truth requires. This is the version of Australian history that is not in the textbooks, or not in the mainstream textbooks in the way that it needs to be. It is the version that Aboriginal historians and community members and activists have been telling in various forms for as long as there has been a colonial Australia to tell it about. It is the version that is slowly, unevenly, and incompletely becoming part of the national conversation. And it is the version that any Australian who wants to understand the country they live in needs to engage with, not as an act of self-punishment, not as a reason for despair, but as the necessary foundation for the honest and equitable society that Australia claims to want to be. The night is deep now, and the stars are the same stars. Somewhere in the Australian interior, people are still learning the stories of country that have been told in that landscape for longer than any recorded history anywhere on Earth. Somewhere a grandmother is teaching her granddaughter the name for a plant in a language that almost didn't survive. Somewhere a young man is learning to read the subtle signs of fire in the grass, the knowledge his great-grandfather carried and his grandfather almost lost and that he is now receiving. Somewhere a community is sitting together and deciding, as communities have always decided, what their future should look like and what they need to get there. And somewhere, perhaps, a person is telling the real story of how this country came to be. The whole story, the true story, the story that starts 60,000 years ago and is still being written tonight under the same ancient sky. That is the story that matters. That is the one that deserves to be heard. And the fact that it is still being told, after everything that was done to silence it, is perhaps the most remarkable thing about Australia. Not the ships that came in 1788, not the proclamations and the flag planting and the legal fictions, but the survival of the knowledge and the culture and the people who held them against all the odds and all the forces arrayed against that survival, down through the generations to the present day. They are still here. The country is still theirs, and the story is still being told. Somewhere in the long silence before sleep, in the space where the rational mind releases its grip on the day's events and something older and quieter rises, you can almost feel the age of this place, the weight of the geology underfoot, the depth of the human history embedded in the landscape, the 60,000 years of accumulated knowledge about wind and water and fire and animal and plant that was built up in this place before anyone in Britain or Europe or anywhere else in the world had any idea it existed. That weight does not press down. It holds. It is not a burden, but a foundation, ancient and stable beneath everything that has happened since, beneath the colonial structures, and the legal fictions and the injustices, and the long unfinished process of reckoning. The country holds all of it, the grief and the violence and the resilience and the beauty, as it has always held everything, with a patience that makes human history seem very young. The people who know this country best, who have been in relationship with it longest, are still here to tell you about it, if you're willing to listen, not just to hear their voices as background to your own story, not just to appreciate their culture as something picturesque and distinctive, but to genuinely listen, to let what they say shift your understanding of where you are and what it means to be here. That is what the real history of Australia asks of you. Not guilt, not despair, but attention. Genuine, sustained, humble attention to a story that is older and richer and more complex than the textbooks have ever found convenient to acknowledge. A story that is still being lived, still being fought over, still being passed from one generation to the next in the languages and the ceremonies and the knowledge systems that somehow survived everything thrown against them. The country is old, its people are still here. The story is not over, and the version that is actually true is so much more extraordinary than the one that was invented to replace it. Rest now. The stars keep their ancient watch. The country holds its history in the stone and the soil and the water and the air, and somewhere, always, someone is still telling the real story. That is enough for tonight to know. There are places in Australia where the ground itself seems to breathe history. The western plains of New South Wales, stretching flat and dry toward the horizon in every direction, carry in their red soil the stories of everything that has happened there. The journeys of the Wiradjuri people across that country, following the seasonal movements of food and water. The arrival of the first squatters in the 1820s, driving their cattle ahead of them into country that already had a name and a people. The violence of the Bathurst War, which was not called a war in the colonial records, but which involved the deaths of significant numbers of Aboriginal people as the settlers pushed inland and the Wiradjuri resisted. The pastoral stations that grew from that expansion, some of them operating until very recently, with Aboriginal workers who received wages held in trust accounts they could not access. You can drive through that country today and see the evidence of all of it, if you know how to look. The remains of sheep stations, the small Aboriginal communities on the edges of towns, often in areas that were set aside as reserves in the 19th century and where families have lived continuously ever since, on land that their ancestors once managed across a much wider territory. The rivers that run intermittently through the landscape, the Lachlan and the Macquarie and the Bogan, which were the arteries of Aboriginal economic and social life across the region, and which are now managed primarily for the needs of irrigation agriculture, often with devastating effects on the environmental flows that the broader ecosystem, including Aboriginal communities' relationship to the river country, depends on. Water is one of the most contested resources in contemporary Australia, and the contest is shaped in important ways by the history of dispossession. The Murray-Darling Basin, which is the major river system of southeastern Australia and the agricultural heartland of the continent, has been massively over-allocated for irrigation since the colonial period. The result has been the declining health of the river system, the loss of environmental flows that the river ecosystems depend on, and periodic water crises that affect both agricultural users and the communities, many of them Aboriginal, that depend on healthy rivers for their cultural and economic life. The Aboriginal people of the Murray-Darling system have been fighting for recognition of their rights to the river system and for the restoration of environmental flows that are essential to the species and the landscapes that their culture and economy are built around for decades. The Murray-Lower Darling River's Indigenous Nations, a coalition of the river communities, has advocated consistently for meaningful recognition of Aboriginal water rights as part of any management framework for the basin. The extent to which that advocacy has influenced the development of the Murray-Darling Basin Plan, which is the current framework for managing water use across the system, is limited. The economic interests of the agricultural sector have dominated the process in ways that critics argue have come at the expense of both environmental and Aboriginal rights. The crayfish of the Murray-Darling system, the Murray cod, the silver perch, the golden perch, are species that have been central to Aboriginal food culture across the basin for thousands of years. Their decline, driven by overfishing, habitat degradation, changed river flows, and the construction of barriers to fish movement, is an ecological crisis that is simultaneously a cultural crisis for the Aboriginal communities whose ceremonies and food practices are built around these species. The restoration of fish populations would require changes to irrigation practices and river management that are politically difficult to achieve. But the cost of not making those changes is paid most directly by the communities that have the least political power to resist the status quo. The story of the Yirrkala Church panels is one that belongs in any honest account of Aboriginal political history. In 1963, the Australian government decided to excise a large area of the Arnhem Land Reserve to establish a bauxite mining operation. This was done without consultation with the Yolngu people, who were the traditional owners of the land. The Yolngu response was to create two painted bark petitions, known as the Yirrkala Church panels, which were presented to the Australian Parliament. The panels combined Western-style petitioning text with traditional Yolngu design, creating documents that asserted, in both cultural frameworks simultaneously, the prior ownership of the Yolngu people of the land being taken from them. The petition was not successful in stopping the mining operation, but it was the first formal recognition by the Australian Parliament of an Aboriginal land rights claim, and it laid the groundwork for the land rights movement that followed. The panels are now held in the Australian Parliament House in Canberra, recognised as documents of national significance. The Yolngu people whose cultural authority they embody continue to live in Arnhem Land and to manage their country according to traditional law, while the mining operation that prompted the petitions continues to extract bauxite from their land. The relationship between Aboriginal communities and the mining companies operating on their land is one of the most complex in contemporary Aboriginal Australia. It ranges from deeply adversarial, where communities are fighting to stop or limit operations they see as harmful to their country and their culture, to genuinely collaborative, where communities have negotiated agreements that provide significant economic and other benefits in exchange for consent to mining on their land. The variation in these outcomes reflects the variation in the legal rights available to communities in different jurisdictions, the relative power of the communities involved, the character of the companies they are dealing with, and the specifics of the country and the resources being extracted. The growth of Aboriginal-controlled economic enterprises is one of the more significant developments in Aboriginal Australia over the past several decades. Community-controlled housing organisations, media organisations, land councils, health services, art centres, and a range of other enterprises represent the development of an Aboriginal economic sector that operates according to community priorities rather than government or corporate priorities. These organizations are often under-resourced and face specific challenges related to operating in remote areas with small populations and limited infrastructure. But they represent a form of economic self-determination that the standard welfare-based approach to Aboriginal policy has never achieved. The emergence of Aboriginal tourism as a significant industry is another development worth noting. The interest of domestic and international visitors in experiencing Aboriginal culture and country has created economic opportunities for communities that have the cultural resources and the physical location to take advantage of it. At its best, Aboriginal tourism involves genuine cultural exchange, with Aboriginal communities sharing aspects of their knowledge and their relationship to country with visitors in ways that are controlled by the community and that reflect the community's own priorities about what is and is not appropriate to share. At its worst, it involves the commodification of Aboriginal culture in ways that are exploitative and that remove authority and economic benefit from the communities whose culture is being sold. The distinction between these two versions of Aboriginal tourism is not always easy to identify from the outside, and the industry has produced both genuinely positive economic and cultural outcomes for some communities, and troubling examples of exploitation and appropriation in others. The frameworks that governments and industry bodies have developed to try to ensure more ethical and more community-beneficial tourism are still evolving. The story of Aboriginal people in Australian cities is one that receives less attention than the more visible stories of remote community challenges. But it is significant. The majority of Aboriginal Australians now live in cities and towns rather than in remote communities, and their experiences of marginalisation and disadvantage are often different in form but not in severity from those of remote communities. Urban Aboriginal people have often been multiple generations removed from their country and from their traditional language and culture, the result of the historical processes of removal and urbanization. They navigate a society that frequently either fails to see them as Aboriginal because they don't conform to the stereotyped image of what an Aboriginal person looks like, or makes their Aboriginal identity the primary lens through which they are understood, while denying the full complexity of their actual lives. The growth of Aboriginal community organisations in cities, providing legal services, health services, housing support, cultural programs, and a range of other services has created a significant urban Aboriginal community infrastructure. These organisations serve people who often have limited access to the community-controlled services available in some remote communities, and who are dealing with the specific challenges of living as Aboriginal people in environments that are not designed with their needs in mind. The Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander legal services, which provide free legal representation to Aboriginal people who could not otherwise afford it, are particularly significant, given the overrepresentation of Aboriginal people at every stage of the justice system. The experience of Aboriginal people within the Australian education system is one of the most consistently documented areas of disadvantage and one of the most persistently difficult to address through policy. Aboriginal students have, on average, lower rates of school attendance, lower rates of educational achievement, and much lower rates of progression to tertiary education than non-Aboriginal students. The reasons for this are complex and interacting. They include poverty and the instability of housing and family circumstances that poverty produces. They include the cultural inappropriateness of many school curricula and teaching approaches for students from Aboriginal backgrounds. They include the historical trauma associated with education, given that schools and school-like institutions were among the primary mechanisms for the forced assimilation of Aboriginal children. And they include the specific challenges of delivering education in remote areas with inadequate infrastructure and high teacher turnover. The approaches to education that have shown the most promise are those that are responsive to the specific cultural and social contexts of the communities they serve, that incorporate Aboriginal language and culture into the curriculum, that employ Aboriginal teachers and support workers, and that work with communities rather than imposing external frameworks. The community-controlled school model, which exists in a number of Aboriginal communities, and which gives communities genuine authority over the education their children receive, has produced better outcomes in many areas than mainstream schools serving similar populations. But it requires sustained funding and policy support to be successful. And that support has been inconsistent. The state of Aboriginal languages is one of the most urgent cultural heritage issues in contemporary Australia. Of the 250 or so distinct language families that existed before colonisation, fewer than 20 are still spoken by significant numbers of people as a first language, and many of those are endangered. The loss of a language is not merely the loss of a communication system. It is the loss of a way of knowing and relating to the world that cannot be fully recovered through translation or description. The knowledge encoded in Aboriginal languages about the specific environments, the specific plants and animals, the specific social relationships, and the specific spiritual frameworks of specific communities is knowledge that exists only in those languages and cannot be fully captured in any other form. The work of language revival, which is being carried out by linguists working in partnership with communities, by community language programs, and by individual speakers and families committed to passing their languages to the next generation, is among the most important cultural work happening in Australia today. It is also chronically underfunded. The resources available for language documentation and revival represent a tiny fraction of what would be needed to do the work at the scale and the speed that the urgency of the situation demands. Some languages have been revived from the point of near extinction by the dedicated work of communities and linguists working together. The revival of the Kaurna language of the Adelaide Plains, which had no fully fluent speakers by the time of contact with linguists in the late 20th century, has produced a community of learners who are now using the language and teaching it to their children. The revival of Darug, the language of the Sydney region, that was virtually lost by the mid-19th century, is producing new speakers who are using the language in ceremony and in daily life. These revivals are remarkable achievements. They demonstrate that it is not too late, that languages that have come close to extinction can be brought back to life. But revival is vastly harder and more resource-intensive than maintenance would have been. Every language that is lost before it can be documented is gone forever. The recording of the last speakers of languages that have no other speakers is a race against time that is being lost in too many cases for lack of resources and attention. The recognition of Aboriginal art and culture by international audiences has been one of the more positive developments in the global understanding of what Australia actually is. The paintings of the Western and Central Desert traditions, often described under the umbrella term dot painting, though that description barely captures the diversity of the tradition, have attracted international attention and commercial interest. They are held in major museums and private collections around the world. They have been the subject of serious critical and scholarly attention that has established them as a significant contribution to the global history of visual art. The stories behind them, the dreaming narratives, and the connections to country that the paintings encode have reached audiences far beyond Australia. This international recognition has not been without its complications. The commercialization of Aboriginal art has produced exploitation alongside economic opportunity. Fake Aboriginal art, produced by non-Aboriginal manufacturers and sold to tourists and collectors as authentic, has been a persistent problem that takes money from the communities whose cultural heritage is being copied. The appropriation of Aboriginal design elements by fashion and design industries without permission or compensation from the communities whose cultural property is being used continues. But the existence of a global audience for Aboriginal cultural production has also created leverage for Aboriginal communities to make their voices heard in contexts where they would otherwise be marginalised. The Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples who have engaged with the international human rights system have found, in some cases, that international attention and international legal standards provide support for their rights, claims that domestic institutions have been unwilling to provide. The declarations and recommendations of UN bodies, while not legally binding in Australia, create political pressure and provide legitimacy to rights claims that Aboriginal communities can use in domestic advocacy. The UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, which Australia initially refused to endorse but eventually endorsed in 2009, provides a framework of rights standards against which Australian policy can be assessed. The assessment, measured against that framework, is not flattering. Australia falls short of the standard of free, prior and informed consent for decisions affecting Indigenous peoples that the Declaration calls for. It falls short of the standards for Indigenous peoples' control over their traditional lands and natural resources. It falls short of the standards for Indigenous peoples' rights to maintain, control, protect and develop their cultural heritage and traditional knowledge. These are not abstract standards. They describe, in international consensus terms, what a just relationship between a state and its indigenous peoples looks like. And Australia has not yet built that relationship. The history of how Australia came to be what it is, and the ongoing story of the relationship between the Australian state and the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples who were here before and who remain, is not a story that should make Australians feel ashamed exactly. Shame is not a productive emotion when it turns inward and becomes paralysis. What the history should produce, when it is honestly engaged with, is something more useful than shame. It should produce understanding. The understanding of how the country's current structures and relationships came to be. The understanding of what those structures mean for the people most affected by them. The understanding of what would need to change for the country to be what it says it wants to be. And from that understanding, ideally action. The action does not have to be dramatic or revolutionary. It can begin with the kind of attention that comes from genuinely learning the history, from seeking out and listening to the voices of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people telling their own stories, from being willing to sit with the discomfort of knowing the truth and letting it shift how you understand the country you're part of. These are small things, but they are not nothing. The accumulation of individual understanding across a large society is the precondition for the political will that makes systemic change possible. The people who have been telling this story for the longest time, the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander communities, and their advocates and allies, are still telling it. They are telling it in the courts and in the parliament and on the street and in the classroom and in the art gallery and at the kitchen table and in the ceremonies conducted on country. They are telling it because it is true and because it matters, and because nothing can be repaired that is not first honestly acknowledged. This telling, tonight, in whatever form it reaches you, is part of that same long conversation. The conversation that began the moment two utterly different worlds collided on the shores of Sydney Harbour in January of 1788, and that has not ended since. The conversation about what happened, what it means, what it requires, and who bears the responsibility for doing what it requires. That conversation will continue long after tonight. It will continue until the distance between what happened and what has been acknowledged and addressed is something closer to the truth. It will continue because the people who need it most have made clear, through 230 years of sustained advocacy and resistance and cultural survival, that they will not stop until it does. And somewhere in the deep quiet before sleep, in the country that is older than any story told about it, that persistence is its own kind of answer. The country holds it, the people carry it, and the story goes on. The rivers of the continent run toward the sea, as they have always run, carrying the sediment of the land through channels that Aboriginal people named and navigated and managed for thousands of years before a European ship ever crossed the horizon. The mountains stand where they have always stood, bearing their original names in the languages that named them. Those names now slowly returning to maps and to signage and to official use as the country edges, imperfectly and reluctantly, but unmistakably, towards something more honest. The red soil of the interior holds the stories of the people who walked it in the compressed evidence of ancient campsites and hearths and stone arrangements and art, waiting with the patience of the geology itself for the attention they deserve. The country is not waiting to be healed. It is not broken in the way that human societies are broken by injustice, and by the failure to acknowledge injustice. It is simply old and patient and full of the history of everything that has happened on it, and everything that has been made of it, and everything that has been lost. It holds all of this, as it has always held everything, in the red rock and the river sand and the dark soil of the forest floor. The people who belong to it, and the country belongs to them as much as they belong to it, are still doing what they have always done, living on the land, managing the land, telling the stories of the land, fighting for the land, teaching their children the names of things in languages that carry 60,000 years of accumulated knowledge about what those things are and how to live with them, demanding of the institutions that claim authority over their lives that those institutions do better, be more honest, come closer to what justice actually requires. This is the real story. Not the version in the textbooks, not the tidy narrative of discovery and settlement and nation building. The real story is messier and older and sadder and more magnificent than that. It has no clean ending because it is not over, but it has a center. And that center is the 60,000 years that came before, and the survival that has come after, and the ongoing insistence of the people who lived all of it that the truth be told and that the truth be heard. That is what tonight's telling has been. An attempt to say, as clearly as can be said in a single long conversation in the dark, what really happened when Britain took Australia, what was there before, what was done, what survived, what continues, what is still required. The country will be here in the morning, as it has always been, old and patient and full, and the people will still be here too, as they have always been. There is a ceremony that takes place in the dark, not the theatrical darkness of a stage or a cinema, but the genuine darkness of a night far from city lights, the kind of darkness that the vast majority of the Australian continent still holds in its interior. A fire has been burning for hours, its coals reduced now to a deep orange glow. The people gathered around it have been through hours of song and dance and story. The ceremony is connecting this generation to every generation that performed it before, stretching back through time to the point where the ceremony was first given to these people by the ancestor beings, whose actions in the dreaming established the patterns by which the world operates. No one performing this ceremony is thinking about what happened in 1788. They are thinking about what needs to happen here, tonight, in the correct way, as it has been happening in the correct way for longer than anyone knows. The country around them is listening in the sense that the ceremony is maintaining the relationship between the people and the country, fulfilling an obligation that is also a privilege, the obligation of the custodians to care for the country by performing the ceremonies that keep it healthy and that keep the connection between people and place alive. The survival of ceremony in Australia, through everything the colonial period did to destroy it, is one of the most remarkable facts of Aboriginal cultural history. Missions and reserves banned ceremony explicitly. Children taken to institutions had no opportunity to learn the ceremonies that their families practiced. The loss of country, through dispossession, meant that ceremonies tied to specific places could no longer be performed in the places they belonged to. The killing of elders in frontier violence removed the knowledge holders who carried the ceremonies in their memories, and yet ceremony survived, in communities that were given no space and no encouragement to maintain their cultural life, in families that practiced what they could in secret and transmitted what they could in the face of active official discouragement, in individuals who carried knowledge that had almost no context in which it could be practiced, and who waited, sometimes for decades, for conditions to change. The conditions did change, partially and unevenly. The land rights movement created the political space for the reassertion of cultural rights. The return of some land to Aboriginal ownership meant the return of access to sacred sites and ceremonial grounds. The growing recognition that the cultural knowledge of Aboriginal people had value, not just in the narrow commercial sense, but in the broader sense of representing irreplaceable human heritage, created some pressure on governments and institutions to support, rather than suppress, cultural maintenance. The men's and women's ceremonies of different Aboriginal cultures are among the most elaborately structured and most deeply meaningful ceremonial traditions that human culture has produced anywhere. They are not performances for audiences. They are serious, sustained engagements with the spiritual and legal frameworks that govern life. They involve extended periods of preparation and learning. They create and reinforce social bonds. They mark transitions in people's lives and connect individuals to the wider community and to the country and to the ancestral beings who establish the patterns of existence. Their maintenance requires significant community investment of time and energy and resources, at a time when communities are also dealing with the practical challenges of poverty and inadequate services and the accumulated effects of historical trauma. The decision to maintain ceremony, to invest in it rather than setting it aside in the face of so many other demands, is itself a political act, an assertion that the life of the community is not only about managing disadvantage, but about affirming what makes the community what it is. The elders who insist on ceremony, who make space for it and protect it and teach it to the young people in their communities, are doing something that matters far beyond its immediate cultural context. They are maintaining the thread that connects the present to the past and the future, the thread that colonization attempted repeatedly to cut and that has been knitted back again and again by the people who understand its importance. The story of the Borroloola community in the Northern Territory is one example, among many, of a community that has maintained ceremony and cultural life through extraordinary adversity. The people of Borroloola, including the Garawa, Mara, Guldanji, and Yanyuwa peoples, were subjected to colonial disruption that reduced their numbers drastically and removed many of them from their country. The town of Borroloola itself was established as a police station in the 1880s, at the height of the frontier violence in the Gulf country. The people who survived gathered around the settlement, maintaining what cultural life they could under conditions that were actively hostile to it. Through the 20th century, the Borroloola communities fought to maintain ceremony, language, and connection to country. They produced linguists and cultural workers who documented their languages and worked to transmit them to younger generations. They pursued land rights claims that eventually resulted in the return of significant areas of country. They established a community-controlled council and health service and media organization, and they continued to perform ceremony in the right places and the right seasons, as they had always done. The Yanyuwa language, which is the traditional language of the sea country around Borroloola, is one of the most complex and most thoroughly documented of any Aboriginal language. It has a highly elaborate grammatical system of noun classes that encodes relationships between people and objects, between land and sea, between humans and non-humans, in ways that are linguistically remarkable. The documentation and teaching of Yanyuwa has been a major project of the community and of the linguists they have worked with for several decades. Young people in Borroloola today are learning the language from their grandparents and from the educational materials that the documentation project has produced. The language is not dead, it is fighting to live. Stories like this one, of communities fighting to maintain what matters to them in the face of everything working against that maintenance, are the counter-narrative to the story of destruction and dispossession. They do not cancel out the destruction, but they complicate the simple story of loss. The colonization of Australia was enormously destructive. It killed enormous numbers of people, destroyed vast amounts of cultural knowledge, damaged and in some cases destroyed irreplaceable ecological relationships. All of this is true. And alongside all of this, Aboriginal people survived, resisted, maintained, revived, created, and continued. Both things are true simultaneously, and the truth of the survival does not diminish the truth of the destruction. The complexity of what happened and what is still happening is not something that can be resolved into a simple moral lesson or a simple political conclusion. The history of Britain's taking of Australia requires sitting with that complexity, allowing it to be as complicated as it actually is, rather than reaching for the comfortable simplifications that both sides of the political debate about Aboriginal history sometimes offer. The simplification that says colonization was simple barbarism. And everything about Australia's current situation is the direct and simple consequence of that barbarism. The simplification that says whatever happened in the past is the past, and the focus should be entirely on practical solutions in the present, without engaging with the history that produced the present. Both of these simplifications miss important truths. The truth is that the colonization of Australia was carried out by human beings who were shaped by their time and their culture and their economic interests, who made specific decisions within those constraints, some of which were worse than the constraints required, and some of which were less bad than they might have been. The truth is that the consequences of those decisions are still being felt, in specific ways that can be traced from cause to effect, and that addressing those consequences requires understanding those causal chains. The truth is that Aboriginal people are not simply victims of history, but actors within it, who have shaped and continue to shape the responses to the conditions they have been placed in. And the truth is that the Australian state has an ongoing responsibility to do better than it has done, and that doing better requires honest engagement with the full history rather than the comfortable edited version. The deep history of Australia, the 60,000 years that the textbook version treats as a prologue, is not just history. It is a living reality encoded in the people and the cultures and the knowledge systems and the relationships to country that survived the colonial assault. That living reality continues to shape what is possible in Australia, what is true about Australia, and what Australia owes to those who held that reality through everything thrown against it. The continent itself, old and patient and full of the evidence of everything that has happened on it, will continue to hold this history long after any individual telling of it. The red rock of the desert will still carry the images carved into it thousands of years ago. The forests will still bear the evidence of the burning patterns that maintained them before the colonists arrived and changed those patterns. The rivers will still know the channels and pools and seasonal rhythms that the Aboriginal people who depended on them knew, even if the rivers themselves have been altered by the demands of irrigation and development. And the people will still be there, in the communities that have held together through everything, and in the cities where Aboriginal life is lived in different forms, but with the same fundamental connections to culture and community and identity. They will still be telling the story, in whatever forms are available to them, insisting that the truth be heard, and that the truth requires something of the country and its institutions. That insistence is not bitterness, though it has earned the right to be. It is not simply anger, though anger is a justified response to what happened and what continues. It is something more fundamental than either of those. It is the insistence of people who know who they are and where they come from, and what they are owed on the basic human right to have that acknowledged. To have it acknowledged honestly, not in the partial and qualified way that the textbook version acknowledges it, but fully as the truth that it is. The truth is that Australia was not discovered, it was invaded. The truth is that the people who were already here were not primitive people without civilization or law or rights. They were sophisticated human societies with 60,000 years of cultural and ecological and intellectual achievement behind them. The truth is that what was done to them in the name of colonization was wrong by any honest moral standard, including the standards of the people who did it, which is why such effort went into constructing legal and intellectual frameworks to justify what could not be justified. And the truth is that the consequences of what was done are still with us, in the lives of the people most directly affected by them, and in the structures of the society that was built on their foundations. These truths do not make Australia irredeemable. They make it, like every human society, a place that has to reckon honestly with its history in order to be what it says it wants to be. The reckoning's not finished. It is barely seriously begun. But the fact that it is happening at all, that Aboriginal people are speaking and being heard in ways they were not heard a generation or two ago, that the history is being told more honestly in more contexts, that the country is edging, however slowly and reluctantly, toward a fuller engagement with what it owes and what it requires, this is something. It is not enough. But it is something, and in the long run of things, measured against the 60,000 years that came before and the centuries that will come after, something's always the beginning of more. The beginning of the harder conversations, the more serious commitments, the more substantial changes. The beginning of the country that Australia could be, if it chose to be honest with itself about the country it has been. Tonight the stars are out, wherever you are, even if the city lights hide them. The country is old and it is patient and it is waiting as it has always waited, for the people on its surface to catch up to what it already knows. The rivers run. The rock holds its stories. The people of the country keep the fires burning, and somewhere, always, the real story is being told. That is the version that matters. That is the one that deserves your attention, your time, your willingness to sit with discomfort and let it teach you something. Not because it is comfortable, but because it is true. And because a country that cannot face its own truth cannot be what it has the potential to be. The night holds all of it, as the night always has, the old and the new and the in-between, the grief and the beauty, the loss and the survival, the 60,000 years and the 230 and everything still to come. Rest now. The country will be here in the morning, its people will be here, the story will be here, and the truth, however late it arrives, is always worth telling. When you think about the scale of what was attempted, the elimination of a civilization from the consciousness of a continent, it is almost incomprehensible. Not because it didn't happen, but because of the sheer ambition of the project. The effort required to rewrite the story of a continent so thoroughly that the people who had been living on it for 60,000 years could be made to seem as though they hadn't existed, or had barely existed, or had existed only as background color for the real story that began in 1788. That is an extraordinary act of narrative violence, sustained over generations, embedded in school curricula and public holidays and national myths and place names and everything else that goes into the construction of a collective story. And yet, the people the story tried to erase are still here, telling their own stories, reclaiming their own names for places, re-entering the public record in ways that the makers of the original erasure never anticipated and could not have prevented. Because the erasure was never complete. It was never going to be complete, because you cannot erase 60,000 years from the land and from the people who belong to it by legislative fiat or by missionary education, or by the removal of children, or by any of the other mechanisms that were tried. You can damage it enormously. You can make it much harder to maintain and to transmit. But you cannot erase what is written in the stone and in the blood and in the stories that have been passed from grandmother to grandchild in whatever snatched moments were available, across 2 centuries of deliberate suppression. The grandmothers who taught their grandchildren what they could, in the language that was supposed to be forgotten, in the songs that were supposed to be silenced, are part of the story too. The men who performed ceremony in secret, on restricted land, at risk of punishment, because the ceremony had to be performed, and because the obligation to the country and to the ancestral beings was not something that a government regulation could override. The parents who sent their children to the mission school and then spent the evenings teaching them the other things, the things that mattered to the family and the community, and that no mission school would ever teach. These are acts of resistance that are as important as the more visible political fights, the court cases and the protests and the petitions. They are the acts that kept alive what the political fights were for. The way that Aboriginal people have navigated the tension between engagement with the colonizing society's institutions and the maintenance of their own cultural integrity is one of the most politically and intellectually sophisticated achievements in Australian history. It is a navigation that has required people to operate in two different worlds simultaneously, to speak the languages of both, to understand the rules and the possibilities of both, and to try to use what the colonizing society's institutions offer without surrendering what cannot be surrendered. Not everyone has managed this navigation with equal success. Some people, particularly those most directly affected by the removal policies and the assimilation programs, lost their connections to community and culture in ways that caused profound and lasting harm. But others maintained those connections, found ways to rebuild them, and created the possibility for the next generation to have access to what had almost been taken. The return journeys, the journeys made by people who were removed from their families and their country, sometimes as children, sometimes as adults, to find their way back to who they are among the most moving stories in contemporary Aboriginal Australia. Not all of these journeys are successful, in the sense of leading to a clear and complete reconnection. The damage done by removal runs deep, and the knowledge and the relationships that were severed cannot always be fully restored. But the impulse to make the journey, to seek the country and the people that are one's own, is itself an expression of something that the removal policies could not destroy. The deep human need for belonging, for roots, for the knowledge of where you come from and who you are. The DNA testing companies that have proliferated in recent decades have been used by some Aboriginal people to confirm connections to communities and country that were severed by the removal policies. They have also been used in troubling ways to try to quantify Aboriginality in terms of blood quantum, a concept that has its own dark colonial history. The idea that Aboriginality is a matter of genetics rather than culture, community, and identity is one that Aboriginal communities have consistently rejected. Identity is not in the blood in that narrow biological sense. It is in the relationships, the knowledge, the community, the culture. These are things that can be learned and taught, that can be maintained across interruption if the will and the means are there. The question of what it means to be Aboriginal in Australia today is one that Aboriginal Australians themselves are best placed to answer, and the answers they give are diverse. There is no single Aboriginal identity, no one way of being Aboriginal, no single set of experiences or beliefs or practices that all Aboriginal Australians share. There is an enormous diversity of cultures, languages, histories, and contemporary circumstances across the continent and across the population. What Aboriginal people share is a connection to the continent and its cultures that stretches back further than any other human connection to any other land. A history of colonization and its consequences that they carry in different ways, but that all of them live with. And a set of rights, claims, and political interests that, while expressed in different ways and pursued through different strategies, derive from that shared history and that shared connection. Understanding this diversity is essential to understanding Aboriginal Australia. Policies and approaches that treat Aboriginal people as a single undifferentiated group consistently fail because they cannot address the specific realities of specific communities. The Yolngu people of Arnhem Land and the Noongar people of southwestern Western Australia, and the Wiradjuri people of New South Wales and the Warlpiri people of the Central Desert, and the Murri people of Queensland are not the same people with the same languages, and the same cultural practices and the same relationships to country and the same contemporary circumstances. They share the broad experience of colonization and its aftermath, but they are distinct peoples with distinct histories and distinct needs. The recognition of this diversity is itself politically significant, because one of the ways in which Aboriginal political claims have historically been dismissed is by treating them as monolithic and therefore inherently divisive of a supposedly unified Aboriginal body of opinion. The reality is that Aboriginal political opinion is as diverse as Aboriginal culture, and that diversity is a strength rather than a weakness. Different communities pursuing different strategies through different means creates a rich and adaptable political movement that can respond to different opportunities and different challenges in different contexts. The Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Social Justice Commissioner, a position within the Australian Human Rights Commission, has been one of the most important official voices for Aboriginal rights in Australia since it was established in 1993. The commissioners who have held this position, including Michael Dodson, Mick Gooder, June Oscar, and others, have produced reports and recommendations that have documented the state of Aboriginal rights and well-being, and have advocated for specific changes with a consistency and a depth of evidence that has been invaluable to the broader rights movement. Their work represents the use of a mechanism created by the colonizing state to hold that state accountable to the standards it claims to uphold. The relationship between accountability and change is one of the central challenges of Aboriginal rights advocacy. Creating mechanisms of accountability through law, through international human rights bodies, through parliamentary oversight, through media attention is essential to producing change. But accountability mechanisms only work if the political will exists to respond to what they reveal. In Australia, that political will has been inconsistent and often absent, particularly when the changes required by accountability conflict with the interests of powerful economic actors or with electoral considerations. The long arc of Aboriginal rights advocacy, stretching from the petitions of the 19th century through the activism of the mid-20th century to the legal victories and political campaigns of recent decades, suggests that change does happen, that persistence and organized advocacy do produce results, even when the results come slowly and imperfectly. The Mabo decision came after 10 years of litigation by Eddie Mabo and his legal team. The apology to the stolen generations came after years of campaigning by Aboriginal people and their allies. The recognition of native title in various agreements across the country has come through patient negotiation in the face of consistent resistance. None of these achievements came easily or quickly. All of them fell short of what justice fully requires. But all of them moved the situation forward from where it had been. The movement forward is not linear. There are setbacks, as there have always been setbacks. Legislation that advances Aboriginal rights is sometimes followed by legislation that qualifies or undermines those rights. Political momentum for recognition and treaty is sometimes followed by political retreat. Funding for community-controlled services is sometimes increased and sometimes cut. The path from where Australia is to where justice requires it to be is not straight and it is not short, but it exists. And the people walking it, the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples, and their allies who have been walking it for 200 years, are still walking. The night is full and the stars are many and the country is old and patient. In the morning, the story continues, as it always has, in the hands of the people who carry it. Not the textbook version, not the convenient abridgment, not the comfortable national myth. The real one, the full one, the one that started 60,000 years ago and that has not yet found its ending. That is the story of what really happened when Britain took Australia. And it is a story that belongs to everyone who lives on this continent, Aboriginal and non-Aboriginal alike. Because the truth of a country's history is part of what the country is. And a country that does not know its true history does not fully know itself. The stars outside are the same stars that have watched all of this unfold. They have watched the fires of Aboriginal management burning across the plains for 60,000 years. They have watched the tall ships arrive and the colony begin. They have watched the massacres and the removals and the legal battles and the protests and the paintings and the songs. They have watched the grandmothers teaching their grandchildren in the language that was supposed to be forgotten. They have watched the young people coming back to country, learning the ceremonies, carrying the thread forward. They will watch what comes next, whatever it is, whoever decides it and whatever shape it takes. The stars have no opinion about the outcome. They are simply there, as they have always been, witnesses to the long human story unfolding on the old stone of this ancient continent. The country will still be here in the morning. Its people will still be here. The real story will still be waiting to be fully told, fully heard, fully reckoned with. And that is, in the end, what tonight was for. Not to resolve what cannot be resolved in a single conversation, but to say clearly and at length and with the care that the subject deserves what really happened, and to let that truth do what truth always does, if you let it, which is to change the way you see things, which is to make the comfortable fictions harder to hold, which is to make the honest accounting both more necessary and more possible. The night is deep, the country is old, the people are here, and the truth, tonight and always, is worth every word it takes to tell it. There is one more thing to sit with before the night takes you completely. Throughout everything described in this long telling, throughout the massacres and the dispossession and the removal of children and the coerced labor and the bureaucratic violence of the protection system, through all of it, there was beauty. Not the beauty that excuses or offsets the harm, but the beauty that exists alongside it, that persists in spite of it, that is itself a form of resistance and a form of insistence that life is more than the worst things done in it. The songs that were sung in the missions after the doors closed. The stories told in whispers to children who needed to know where they came from. The paintings made on bark and canvas that carried the dreaming forward into forms the world could receive. The dances performed on country when country was finally returned, after years or decades of exile. The meetings held between elders to ensure that the knowledge most at risk was written down or recorded before the last of its holders were gone. The young people learning language in classrooms and at kitchen tables and on country. The words of their grandparents' world finding homes in their mouths. All of this is beautiful. It is beautiful in the way that any act of survival against enormous odds is beautiful. In the way that human creativity finding expression despite everything working to suppress it is beautiful. In the way that the thread of culture passing from one generation to the next, unbroken across 2 centuries of deliberate interruption, is beautiful. It does not make what happened acceptable. Nothing makes that acceptable. But it is part of the truth, and a truth told without it is incomplete. The beauty and the grief are not opposites in this story. They are companions. They have always been companions in the long human experience of living with loss and with the insistence on more than loss. The lament and the love song are not contradictory. They are 2 expressions of the same knowledge. The knowledge that what was had was real and precious, and that its loss is mourned, and that its remnants and its continuations are celebrated, and that the future, however uncertain, is still worth hoping for. The Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples of Australia have been living with that combination of grief and hope for 2 centuries. They carry the grief honestly, because to minimize it would be to dishonor the people who suffered. And they carry the hope because to abandon it would be to surrender to the project of those who wanted them gone. That refusal to surrender is perhaps the deepest and most important truth that the real history of Australia reveals. The night holds it all. The old stone and the new words, and the ancient songs and the continuing story, and the people who carry it forward, and the country that has always been here and always will be. Rest now. The morning will come, and with it, always the story continues. The kookaburra will laugh at dawn, as it always does, the sound of a continent that has been here far longer than the names we give it. The red light of morning will touch the stone of the ranges, and the rivers will run as they always run, and the country will be, as it has always been, exactly itself. Old and patient and full of everything that has happened on it and everything that is still to happen. Ancient beyond ordinary comprehension and intimate in ways that only the people who have lived in relationship with it for the longest can fully know. You carry some of this now. Whatever part of tonight's telling reached you in the space between waking and sleep, whatever thread of the real story found its way into your understanding, that is enough. That is the beginning of something. The beginning of the honest engagement with a history that is complicated and painful and necessary, that is the foundation of a more truthful relationship to the country and to the people who have always been its true custodians. The stars are still out, the country is still old, the people are still here, and the truth, as always, is worth every word it takes to speak it into the dark. Sleep well, wherever you are. The story will be here in the morning. The emu walks the plains in the early morning, as it has always walked them, following paths that are older than any road ever laid across this continent. It does not know the history of the land it walks. It does not need to. It simply walks in the way that its ancestors walked, along routes that were known and managed and named by human beings for 60,000 years before anyone thought to call this place Australia. The emu walks, the country holds, the people remember. And the real history, patient as the stone it is carved into, waits for the ears that will truly receive it. That is all it has ever done. Wait, and the waiting too is a kind of strength. Good night from the oldest continent on Earth.